Okay, so again, welcome everybody. My name's Michelle Maloney. I'm the National Convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and really pleased to have you all joining us this morning for this really wonderful opportunity to hear from Gethin Morgan, a person who has been a pioneer in the classification of the beautiful ecosystems in Australia. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Gethin today. Before we do that, there's a number of housekeeping tasks, an acknowledgement of country, and an introduction to Ayla's work that I'd like to share so that you can see the context of how and why we're running the workshops that we're running around planetary boundaries and bioregions. In a moment, I'll do the acknowledgement of country for my part of the world. I live in Brisbane. I'll tell you a bit about the Planetary Boundaries series that we're running this month and into the next 2 months. And then we'll talk a bit about the program for today. And I'd like very much to introduce you to Ayla's work, and particularly why bioregions are really important to our Green Prints program. So I would like to firstly acknowledge the country upon which I live, work and play. I'm based in Brisbane, which is the beautiful homelands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. For those who've participated in our workshops this week, you'll have seen this photo before, but I love to use it as a centre point for saying I live in a suburb called Banyo, which is the local language word for ridge. And this lovely waterhole is called the Nudgee Waterholes. Nudgee means black duck. And a nearby suburb is called Nunda, and that actually means waterhole. So really, I'm acknowledging that I live in the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, but I'm particularly close to the Nudgee Nunda, the black duck waterhole, and I get to walk there with my doggies, even though I'm in an urban area. So I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present and the amazing First Peoples of this continent who I'm privileged to work with, call my friends and colleagues, and I'll talk about the work we do within our sister organisation, Future Dreaming, around First Nations knowledge and wisdom later in my presentation. So for those who haven't been with us all week, we actually started our Planetary Boundaries series on Wednesday with a one-day workshop. I can see a number of familiar names and faces of people who joined us on Wednesday, and I'm sure you'll agree it was just fascinating, truly wonderful day, listening to different folks talk, like Will Steffen, talk about Earth System Science, Catherine Trebek from the We All Economy Alliance talking about donut economics, which was informed by planetary boundaries, and all of these issues looking at our beautiful planet, trying to understand our limits and the impacts we've had as industrialized societies. And today, a really important element within the concepts of understanding ecological limits and rethinking sustainability, particularly from the perspective of industrialized societies, is the concept of bioregions. Oh, sorry, that was the slide for Will's presentation. So why is Ayla concerned with planetary boundaries, ecological limits and bioregions? The Australian Earth Laws Alliance was created in 2012. Our mission is to increase the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centred governance. And by that we mean we're very interested in the underpinning structures in industrialised society, such as law, economics, education, politics, ethics. We're very interested in shifting from a human-centred, pro-growth and relatively destructive worldview and civilisation back towards what First Nations peoples have never lost, which is an earth-centred worldview, but also a world-centred daily practice, daily ethic, and material way of living. Ayla was created by a group of lawyers deeply concerned about the role of law in continuing the Western industrial society's notion that we're separate from nature, above nature, able to just abuse it and use it as we wish. But rapidly, since we started, our work has generated a lot of interest from people across professions and different cultures. And we are first and foremost interested in the interconnected systems change required for industrialised societies or modern societies like Australia to really rethink how we live, work and exist and support the living world on our continent. And so one of the key areas of our interest is how we can live within our ecological limits, our planetary boundaries. You know, how can we do that? So this image, I always wheel it out. I'm sure you've seen it all on Facebook, but Ayla is inspired by a theory called Earth jurisprudence, which is really just Westerners like the wonderful deep ecologist Thomas Berry connecting us with the idea and reminding us that our systems, our laws, our economic systems are deeply human-centered. And what we have to do is try to get back to an earth-centered way of being. And of course, conceptually, that's easy to think about, particularly if you're a nature lover like myself. But how do we literally unravel the mess that we've made, particularly since the European Industrial Revolution, heightened by the post-Second World War Great Acceleration, where technological capacity has meant we can drain the waterways and take the fish and cut the trees and dig the holes at an escalating rate. So how do we, as people of the descendants of the European colonizers and the folks with some of the early ideas of expansionism and colonialism, actually take a step back and go, how do we change the way we think about the living world? And how do we sit still and actually learn to live in a place forever, as opposed to use it up and move on? So in a nutshell, Earth jurisprudence or Earth-centered thinking would suggest that industrial societies have failed to manage their relationship with the living world. And as we heard from Will Steffen yesterday in his masterclass, and several other speakers on Wednesday, particularly with donut economics, the unfairness and the extractivism of modern globalized societies doesn't just impact on the beautiful living world, it impacts on our fellow human beings and the lovely relationships we should have, where inequities have never been so severe as they are today. So within Ayla's work, and I won't talk too much about the different themes of our work, but changing culture, building the capacity of community, particularly at a time when government fails to show leadership on sustainability. And again, I'm sure many of us are aware of it, but when Will was talking yesterday, he really brought to the forefront how uninterested the federal and state governments are in concepts like planetary boundaries and other important new ways of thinking about our type of civilization and our ways of using resources. So Ayla is really focusing on how we can create alternatives and show really viable, compassionate, flourishing ways to live, work and play, particularly in the Australian continent. In light of that, I'm going to run through these dot points pretty quickly and then just show you why bioregions are a really great starting point for us as legal and governance nerds, and why they hold a really important key into unlocking the potential of rethinking sustainability in Australia. And again, that's why I'm so thrilled that someone like Gethin Morgan, who's been so pivotal to making these systems in the first place, is able to share his knowledge with us. But of course, Ayla's running these workshops to help people activate and come together to really use this knowledge in a way that will push back at the systems that are destroying what we all love, our living world. So very quickly, our concerns in terms of the current environmental governance systems in Australia can be wrapped up pretty quickly in these dot points, but of course, this is very simplistic. I've already talked about the human-centeredness of our current laws and economics, these broader underpinning governance structures in Australia. But it's really important to the work of Ayla to remind people that in our current legal system, the living world is nothing more than the property of human beings. Typically, it's the property of the Crown, who leases and allows others to use and exploit it. And that's where rights of nature comes as a spearhead concept to challenge the idea that nature's just out there for us. Its inherent right to exist and its inherent need to live and thrive, as well as support us, is a critical part of rethinking how we do stuff in Australia in the mainstream culture. We also already have mentioned the pro-growth culture. I'll talk in a minute about why Ayla and other groups are focusing as well on many issues, but including the economy and challenging the dominant economic paradigm of pro-growth or endless growth on a finite planet. We're also very concerned about government and corporate control, not just of the land itself, but of the information. And many would argue that we live today in a society that could be defined as a plutocracy, where we see elite control between many elements of government and large businesses. We also have concerns about the top-down standardised approach to environmental law. And once Gethin talks about bioregions, you'll see clearly that there's a real strong need for us to, number one, understand and respect the differences and the unique elements of the physical world around us. And number two, learn from Aboriginal societies who fundamentally had a governance system across a continent that was built on autonomous, bioregional groups, family groups, clans, and civilization. So there's a whole bunch of other concepts, including this flawed notion inside Western society, particularly in the Australian system, where we're constantly looking at the patchwork quilt of what's left. I know that this decade has been called by the UN the decade of restoration, but certainly our Western view has always been that we would save a few reserves and a few national parks. But as Ross Williams, a Bindul man, spoke about on Wednesday, Aboriginal people never saw one place more important than another. One place could be destroyed while another place preserved. All of country was managed, but also looked after in a regenerative way. So even challenging some of these notions that appear to be protecting the living world, and they do, national parks are really fantastic and important, but we need to do more in our society. And the colonial culture and mindset is something we work on really diligently inside AILA and with sister organisation Future Dreaming. Very quickly, just turn now to the bioregions and to share with you why AILA is running these workshops, why we want to increase understanding of bioregions. We nicknamed the project or the pathway that we're developing Green Prints because although we have blueprints, we have had them for hundreds of years, which is the concept of documenting and designing human constructs, we don't have anything similar to really understand Australia the pathways we can take to build truly regenerative and sustainable human societies. So green prints are a way of helping us think about the myriad ways in which we can change both the planning for the future and the actions in the present. And the reason that green prints is built on nested sustainability is, for anyone who's older than say 2025, you would know that in the 80s and 90s, sustainable development endorsed by the government was a terrific start to rethinking endless growth, but it was flawed because it saw economy, environment, and society as equal strands or equally important pillars, whereas that led to decision-making tying itself inside out to make sure the economy and economic growth continued to be dominant. And as some of us say, it produced Mickey Mouse sustainability. It certainly hasn't stopped the destruction of the natural world. We've heard just in the last week the response to the EPBC Act review, which has shown the devastating legacy of impact on the environment since colonisation in 1788, and the federal laws in the last 50 years haven't helped much to make a difference. The solution, of course, is making sure that we see ourselves as human beings, both as connected and part of, a humble part of the living world, and we make sure that our economy and our social structures fit inside that. We've heard this week about how Planetary Boundaries offers quite a profound way to look at biochemical processes of the entire planet. Modern science in the 21st century has caught up with First Nations knowledge and the Gaia theory from the 60s that the planet operates as one big interconnected system. And for anyone who didn't join us yesterday or the day before, you're very welcome to connect with the video recordings of Will Stephen's talk and the literature and lists of reading that he'll be sharing with us around planetary boundaries. But Green Prints starts, I've got a quote there, all models are wrong, some models are useful. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but what we're very concerned about is how local communities in Australia can connect with the very best thinking around regenerative ag, sustainable futures, all of the different tools and mechanisms, but also connect with the work that's being done at the planetary scale and ensure that all of the amazing work that folks like Holger Hoff, who spoke to us on Wednesday about downscaling planetary boundaries, can join up in such a way that we're really focusing on how to live within our ecological limits. So the big question is, how do we do that at the local level? And one of the first things we have to do is actually set limits. Elinor Ostrom, in her Nobel Prize winning work on sharing the commons, talks about one of the key things is setting the boundaries. And that's one of the issues that's actually been missing in decades of sustainability work. No one actually drew a line around something and said, this is what we have to do to be sustainable here forever. It was always more about how do we do this more sustainably or that more sustainably. And that's why focusing on bioregions, and I can talk about that later, but focusing on bioregions helps us look both at the global, national, regional, and even our individual and household scale. Gethin will talk about why these classifications And it is acknowledged it's only a Western scientific view of the living world. There are many ways to see the world. But for a lot of folks who are in our society and are disconnected from nature, it's a really wonderful starting point to ask questions about where do I live? What am I connected to? With the classifications that have now settled in, and Gethin will tell us more about the processes that happened to design these systemic ways of looking at the living world from the geology up. Greenprint simply says, if we looked at bioregions as a way that Mother Earth is telling us what's here in this place, then we can use bioregions as a really important stepping stone to understand how to bring together all of the different existing tools for sustainability. We get to know not just the fragments of a national park, but what the whole bioregion is meant to look like when it's healthy. What should it be doing into the future to support life and to support us? How do we think about different elements of knowledge sharing, whether we're looking at Indigenous knowledge and connecting with First Nations peoples, modern history, natural sciences, what's actually going on, and how do we know what we think we know about this place? First Nations knowledge and the sharing of it is a key issue in our Future Dreaming sister organisation, which we've been running workshops, if anyone's interested, run by Mary Graham and Ross Williams, pretty amazing Indigenous. And then the scenarios for bioregional health. This is where Greenprints really comes into its own. It's helping people rethink both the way we live in a place, reflecting what Mother Nature needs to survive and thrive, and also redesigning the economic system itself, which all sounds very grand, but for 4.5 years, we've been building this network that just keeps growing, that helps people build alternatives to the current reality. So Greenprints is first and foremost about rethinking how we live in a place, and then retrofitting different kinds of thinking and laws and rules and institutions into the future so that we can embed and enshrine a greater care for country, a greater cultural respect for the First Peoples, but do it in a way that we can all live here forever. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say about that. For those who have heard this talk on Wednesday morning, I apologise, but I really wanted to share it with you again. These workshops are an important way for us to connect with other people in Australia who are looking at these kinds of incredible generative projects. So if you are interested in staying connected with Ayla and the Greenprints project, please do shoot us an email anytime. We're a growing body of experts and volunteers and students and professionals connecting in with us. So thank you so much for listening to me when you signed up to join in with Gethin. And again, just a reminder to everyone who's just joining, can you please make sure you stay on mute? That would be terrific. So over to you, Gethin. Before I'd like to introduce, I was gonna say before I let Gethin chat to you, I met Gethin by sheer accident a couple of years ago on Magnetic Island when I was giving a talk about greenprints and bioregions at a new economy workshop in Magnetic Island. And it was pretty wonderful to have this gentleman wander up to me and say, oh, that's interesting. And he asked me a few questions about bioregions. And I said, oh, why do you ask? And he said, well, I was one of the people who helped build the classification system for bioregions. So I felt like I'd kind of met and spoken to the Holy Grail of bioregions. So I'm really pleased to now introduce Gethin Morgan, who has decades of experience in both, I guess, the science, but also the machinations of the policy world trying to get this information out. So Gethin, thank you for listening to me yet again. And can I hand over to you to introduce yourself and kick off for the day?
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, I'll just bring up the first maps. Now, this morning there'll be 3 sessions. So the first session, I'm just going to give an overview again of the history and processes to develop bioregional classification in Australia. And why they are important for understanding boundaries and limits and integrity of landscapes. The next session, starting at 10:45, just explain some of the different terminologies in a bit more detail. and then go into the regional ecosystem approach, which is the finest level of mapping that we've got in Queensland. And then in the third session, starting at 11:30, look at the desert uplands in central Queensland to show how powerful a tool the mapping is for looking at landscapes and land use. Okay, so I suppose the important thing is that everything's connected, yes, but species have a name and we can talk about them. If landscapes had a name, we could talk about them too, and we could all talk about the same landscape. So boundaries are important in defining where landscapes change, what the differences are, extrapolating information, all those sorts of things. And so coming up with a framework that you could talk about landscapes in an integrated and hierarchical way, you can imagine, becomes very powerful, just like species are described hierarchically, families, classes, orders, you know. Landscapes now have a similar sort of hierarchy. So just to go through the evolution of them, it's easy to forget that most of Australia is and still is quite difficult to get into. But looking back into the early 1900s, very few roads. Air photos didn't start to get used for mapping until the 1930s. And, you know, as the knowledge of Australia grew, then the broad views were able to be developed. So I'll just quickly work through some of the main changes. So one of the first ones, first approaches to breaking up large areas of land is this one in Western Australia. And if you know Western Australia, you know how abrupt the changes are and how close they are to the Perth, the first settlement. So in 1906, a German botanist, based on his own travels and the knowledge of friends, put together this preliminary map of the main differences. And so you can see Coolgardie shows the arid part of the state, and then the wetter areas he's broken up into some finer subdivisions. This is a really interesting one. This is the first time that the term natural regions was used. Now, it's primarily based on geology and landform, with a understanding of the vegetation changes too. This was done by geologist Clark in 1926. And he explained it in a similar way to how my work developed, which was looking at major landforms. So on the table, you can see there's just two major landforms, the plateau that dominates the state, and then a coastal strip. He breaks that up according to the geologies, and then within similar geologies, you can break it up according to the climate. And so he ended up with 15 different natural regions. The states then started to appoint botanists to look after, primarily driven by forestry, but basically to understand the botany of the state. And Gardner was very much had an ecological view, as many botanists do. And we start to see here a much finer definition and much more confident lines. Very few dotted lines, but you know, overall, similar divisions down here, but starting to get better resolution in the remote areas. At the same time, the continental picture was building. So in 1960, this was botanist Burbage's view of the major floristic differences across the country. So you had the southwest forests, the southeast forests, the tropical forests, and then the arid and semi-arid areas. At the same time, the geological mapping was starting to gain momentum. So by 1962, the main sedimentary basins were identified, but the detail was still lacking. The most geological work was going on in the hard rock areas where there were minerals, and there was an economic imperative to go searching in detail. And I mentioned geology, of course, because that's the foundation of landscapes. So you can see here the migration of a line. So this is the line between the Eremayan arid part of Western Australia and the wet coastal. So this was the 1906 line, 1944, and finally coming through to Beard in the 80s. So in 1946, the Bureau of Mineral Resources was formed. They mapped their first 1 to 250,000 map sheet in 1951 in Urandangi around the Mount Isa country. In 1946, CSIRO started integrating landscape mapping, looking at landforms, soils and vegetation. And come the 60s and 70s, with diversity and landscape starting to be viewed in a holistic way, the national park departments being set up around Australia, and a more systematic approach being sought to protect landscapes, the drive to integrate classification across the country gathered momentum. And in 1975, myself and Peter Stanton were asked to develop a rapid approach to identifying acquisition priorities for national park in Queensland as a case study to be developed further around Australia. So the basis had to be geology. There wasn't a lot of mapping around. There was land system mapping for the west. There was the odd bit of vegetation mapping down the east, but the geology certainly integrated it. And just looking at this geology map, you can see some very broad patterns that fell out into the bioregions ultimately. So you can see here the folded old rocks of the Mount Isa inlier, these big extensive plains around the Gulf, the complex geologies of the eastern geosynclines, southeast Queensland here, and then the Great Artesian Basin coming down to here. So all the shales of the Mitchell grass, all the wind-blown dunes of the Channel country and the deserts, and then all this unconsolidated outwash that's been washed off the rim of the Great Artesian Basin and filled these lower areas here. So to chase those bioregions boundaries and say, well, where does that change to there? Is it simply a geological boundary or more in a more complex way? Coming from the wet tropics here, the rainforests of Cooktown down to Ingham, where do they change to the drier inland countries? Is it a rainfall boundary? Does the vegetation reflect the rainfall well enough to use? Is there detailed enough vegetation mapping available? How reliable is the line? So in 1975, with very little detailed information available, the lines were seen as a first cut, but having gone to the detail of land systems and vegetation and scanning air photos for the entire state, we were pretty confident and the boundaries have stood the test of time. So we came up with 13 bioregions in Queensland. So this is a map I showed the other day. It's one of the early land system maps from 1970, and it shows the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Cape York Peninsula here with the boundary between the either in situ or reworked, eroded and redeposited deposits, and then the big alluvial fans of the Mitchell River and the the Gilbert River down here. Now, the integrated approach is really important because it helps you understand how landscapes work. So if you look at these three colours here, the dark green here is the active floodplain of the Mitchell River at the moment. The lighter green is when it's in high flow, it spills out and covers this area here. Lots of beautiful wetlands and so on, whereas this is the sandier soils of the immediate breakout, of the immediate breakout of the water. And when floodwaters leave the main channel, they lose speed quite quickly, drop their heavy load, and then the finer load goes out and gives these lovely plains here. You can see the way these watercourses radiate outwards, that's a high point. That's where all the depositions are occurring. These are older depositional areas, so they slope away. Similarly down here. In here, you can see the watercourses avoid this area. They're running around the edges of it. So these are lower and they're being pushed together and gathering here. So just a simple analysis of stream patterns starts to show you how the landscape's operating. You build in the geological map and you start to understand how old they are. And you look at the land systems and you can start to see, well, these are young soils. They've got river red gum and melaleucas, the big tall leucodendrons and so on them. Out in this older country that doesn't flood as frequently and is old enough for soils to be heavily leached and less fertile and so on, you've got lower woodlands of scraggly melaleucas and things. And you can do similar analysis over in Cape York. But just to look in detail, down in this corner here, there's a little bit of shale exposed. Now, this is the Currumba Basin. It's a northern extension of the Great Artesian Basin. So the underlying sandstones have got shales on top of them, and then all that stuff was washed out to make these fans. So there's a little bit of shale here. And if you look at the land system report, there's the underlying shale, there's a bit of sand covering them, and they identify 3 land units. So the first land unit is 45% of the land system, and that's the sandy covering with bloodwood stringy bark on it. And then where the shales are exposed and eroding, you get these little breakaways with lancewood on it, or maybe these little melaleucas. And then finally, out on the flats where there's a bit of deposition going on and the soils may be a bit deeper, you get paper bark and bloodwood. So a lot of detail in these reports, and it gives a really strong basis for understanding boundaries and pinning them down. So that's where we ended up. Back in the days when you used ink pens and rub-on letters to make maps. So that was done in 1975 and pretty much still is where the bioregions are. In 1980, Beard, a botanist in WA who took it on himself to map the entire vegetation of the entire state at 1 to 1 million, pinned down these natural regions for the first time, and he too called them natural regions, which is what Peter and I called the Queensland ones, because to us that's what they were. In 1986, my wife and I did a similar map in Western New South Wales. So you can see the Darling Plains, Queensland's summer rainfall coming in, lots of bedrock geologies here, but again, mostly summer rainfall. And then the Riverina down here getting mostly the winter rainfall and dominating the flows. Sands down in the lower areas, Broken Hill bedrock, and the western slopes of New South Wales. And then a key, just to show how you can pull them apart. So you can see the geology here is absolutely fundamental. So you've got all the young deposits, the quaternary ones that are unconsolidated. So that's the alluvials and sandy wind-blown stuff. You've got the Mesozoic bedrock, so that's primarily the Great Artesian Basin. And then you've got all the older rocks, which are the big geosynclines that form the eastern ranges. And then within the Quaternary deposits, you can split them into broad areas of alluvial sediments, and then the wind-sorted sediments. And then you can break the alluvials into these ones. So the Darling River, summer rainfall dominant woodlands and grasslands, the Murray Plains, the winter rainfall, shrublands, grasslands. And if you've driven across the Hay Plain, you've seen the blue bush shrublands and so on. So very different. And you can work your way down through all those bioregions and see quite clearly their genesis and their core characteristics. In 1993, the Australian and New Zealand Environment and Conservation Council of Environment Ministers decided to establish a national reserve system. And they decided on using bioregions, by which time had become widely accepted in most states, using bioregions as the framework for establishing where they should direct their money to the states. And it was important because when the states smelt the money, their initial response was to try and use it to fill what they perceived to be the gaps. So often it was in holdings in existing national parks, which could be very expensive. And it would just reflect their own state priorities rather than a national priority. So the first workshop to establish the Australian framework was in 1994, and come 1995, the states, experts from the states meeting together compared their classification systems and rationalised them, rationalised the cross jurisdiction issues. Like often a boundary would change when it got to the state because the different states have different ways of mapping and different data sets, and they don't always align. So you needed to understand then and agree on what the bioregions on either side were representing and refine those boundaries. And through that process, 130 original jurisdictional bioregions were reduced down to 80. And that's this one here in 1995. This was the first publicly released map. IBRA stands for Interim Bioregionalisation of Australia, and it was called interim and is still called interim because it's under a constant process of refinement as knowledge increases and mapping improves. And so over the years, that's what's happened. The different states and territories have pursued more and more detail and slowly refined these boundaries. Now, the thing is with the bioregions, they're really good for presenting summary information. So you can colour them up according to the extent of national park within them, for example, and that has some meaning and it gives you some sense of where the parks are in respect to these natural regions, if you like. But they've still got a lot of internal heterogeneity, so we need to go down another step next. And so in 2001, the National Land and Water Audit contracted me to develop sub-regions and use them as a framework for reporting landscape health across Australia. So we went through the same process, sitting down with experts, 2 or 3 main experts from each state. And by 2001, we identified 354 sub-regions. Oh, sorry, I've just got to go back. 354 sub-regions and come up with an overall rating for landscape stress. So let me just see where the... I've lost the landscape stress map. Okay, so there's where we ended. That's where we've ended up now, following further refinement. We've gone from 354 subregions to 419. In 2013, this is a 2012 map, in 2013, the Commonwealth pulled out of the National Reserve System acquisition program, and so that took the impetus out of further refinement. And so this is pretty much where it sits at the moment. So I'll just go on now, I'll leave that up there, and I'll just go on to talk about briefly why bioregions are important for understanding ecological systems. So you can see from the strength of the classification, the detail on which it's based, these different scales really provide a reliable framework for predicting the extent of something, particularly the distribution of soil, vegetation, and fauna. And particularly when you don't have the detail, if you've got a reasonable geological map and a bit of information for somewhere else in the subregion for that sort of geology, you can start to extrapolate with some confidence what you're going to find there. And then air photos or satellite imagery to get a pretty good shot at confirming it. You can also, of course, then extrapolate land management knowledge for those areas. If something works on shales in one part of the subregion, it's likely to work on shales in another part of the subregion. And similarly, monitoring the trend. If you compare an area of shale that's been really heavily grazed in the subregion with an area of shale that seems to be in better condition somewhere else, you can generally say, well, you know, they're of equal characteristics, and so any change is due to land use, accepting the patchiness perhaps of rainfall and so on in a particular season. But in the longer term, you can put it down to land use. So in Queensland, we were able to use the bioregions to develop tree clearing guidelines that applied across bioregions and to a lesser extent subregions. We could look at the extent and condition of ecosystems and hence work out their conservation status in terms of how much was left and what condition it was in. We could report reservation status, species distributions, threatened species and so on in the state of environment reporting. We could start bioregional planning assessments for the bioregions because of the detail we now had for them. And we could start to look more closely at conditions. So for instance, with remote sensing, with satellite imagery, with a lot of work and the RE framework, you can start to look at reflectivity and how that within a regional ecosystem, and understand that increased reflectivity is likely to reflect ground cover and landscape condition. Subregions are now used nationally for analysing landscape health, as in the study I did, and biodiversity, including condition and trend in clearing, distribution of weeds, feral animals, soil degradation, hydrological change, threatened species and ecosystems, and of course representative in the National Reserve System. So the REs, and we'll get onto them in the second session, the REs are mapped at a scale of about 1 to 100,000, and their relative internal consistency means that we can now go down below subregion and start to look at, as I said, changes in land use and its impacts. And that then starts to you can then start to understand the constraints of each of those types of land, what they will recover from, what they won't, and hence start to look at not just condition, but paths to recovery. Okay, well, look, that's what I've got for this session. So I might step back for questions now. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Gethin. We do actually have a couple of questions coming in there. You might want to keep your slides up in case folks come in with more. So I apologise, I think I forgot to actually introduce that what we'll be doing is making sure Gethin has time to talk and then some questions with you, and then time to talk and then questions with you. So we'll aim for, I think we're looking at 3 presentations really, aren't we, Gethin? And then for chat afterwards, after each one.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. In which case, folks, if you've got some questions, please pop them in the chat box. It's often the quickest way to do it, but we've already got a couple here, Gethin. Bridget has asked, can Gethin please provide more detail about what he describes as landscapes having hierarchies? According to my understandings from original cultures, they reject the notions of hierarchies.
Okay, well, I'm using hierarchies in the sense of scales, I suppose. So you can look at a map like this and you can see both bioregions and then the subregions nested within them. So that's the hierarchy I'm talking about. So Aboriginal peoples recognise, for instance, in Arnhem Land, the sandstone escarpments, the floodplains and so on. So at a broader level, I suppose you could say the nation state. At a finer level, you might say the clans, a particular clan mainly used the floodplain and maybe occasionally up onto the scarps, whereas a different clan mainly used the Arnhem Tablelands. Or, you know, just to give the sense that the hierarchy is related to the landscape scale. So it goes from the bioregion to the subregion. Within the subregion, you might have, say, plains and undulating plains on shale and alluvial systems along the major watercourses. So then the alluvial system is or one or the other is the next step down in the hierarchy. And there are even finer divisions, but you start to talk about mapping them at a property scale, not at a state or a regional scale. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Gethin. Yeah, Bridget has said thank you. And I guess it should be noted, and we talked a bit about this on Wednesday in the longer workshop because Ross Williams, a Bindal juryman, spoke about Aboriginal knowledge of landscape. The bioregions are, you know, very much coming from the Western science tradition, and they come from that form of epistemology where people think about the world a certain way and classify it a certain way. I think Gethin would be the first one to note, as I do in my own work, that First Nations people's knowledge of country and landscape and regions was extensive and very different in a lot of ways to how Western science sees the world. But Gethin, did you have any thoughts on that sort of the difference between the knowledge systems?
Yes, look, all I can say is that this is just a framework for understanding differences. You know, you can to compare this with Aboriginal knowledge of the landscape, it's just, you just can't. I mean, we're talking about a peoples that had 50 or 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge, you know, and it was built in the culture, it was built, the whole lot was, had evolved together over all those years. So their understanding of seasonality, landscape processes, fire, species, habits, the whole thing. I mean, and in an integrated way, built into their memories through story and behaviour. I mean, it's just we're not even on the same page. At this stage, all we're saying is we understand that these different types of land function differently, and some are going to be in better condition than others, and some are going to we're going to need to respond in this way for those areas, in that way for them. And I'll get on in the third session to using this information to start to guide recovery and monitoring, for example.
Thank you, Gethin. That was a very beautiful answer. Another question here, and I'm sorry, the person is named on their Zoom account as Bumblebee, which is very beautiful. So Bumblebee asks, with landscapes always changing, how is this change factored in? Is it through periodic reviews of bioregions?
Yes, it's an interesting question. These are, because these are based strongly on geology, and the way climate and geology interact leads to landforms and soils. And then the way climate interacts with them leads to vegetation and then and the fauna that can use that vegetation and soils and so on. So these are landscapes that are constantly evolving, but at a geological timescale. Given the changing nature of the climate, of course, these changes are going to speed up more quickly, are going to really speed up. So where the boundary, for example, is reflected by a climatic change. So if you go west from the wet tropics, you go from the plains up onto the highlands, and then as they drop away to the west and the orographic rainfall is reduced, you go through a narrow band of what are called ecotone forests, which are tall wet forests, with or without a rainforest understory. They used to have a grassy understory, but its lack of fire has led to invasion by rainforest species in many places. They will be the first ones to suffer. So the fire will start to be introduced back into them, and we've seen that happening at the back of the Mackay there in those Yungala fires. In Townsville, we've seen it in fire intruding to the back of the wet tropics in the Blue Water area. So those climate-related boundaries will certainly slowly change. And of course, we're going to start to get vegetation changes. What with increasing severity and frequency in bushfires, there's going to be major changes all over. What we've got here, I think, is a starting point for monitoring and understanding changes and hopefully responding to them.
Excellent, thank you, Gethin. I'm just looking through the next questions, trying to order them in a way that's beneficial to the group. Linda has said, I have the SEQ, the Southeast Queensland regional plan in front of me, and there's no mention of bioregions. There's some attention to Indigenous cultural values, regional biodiversity, landscape values, economic resource areas. How can the relationship between regional planning and bioregional awareness be strengthened in such an urbanising and developing region? And Gethin, perhaps you could use this question to also speak to the sort of historic difference between using and looking at, I know you're going to talk more about it, but bioregions versus, say, catchment areas or other ways of classifying land.
Okay, well, all these things are scale related. So somewhere like Brisbane, the plan will be contained within the bioregion. So they won't mention any other bioregions. That is the bioregion. And so the biodiversity section, I presume, will be based on the ecosystem mapping and the various essential habitat that's mapped for the threatened species and so on. So that's all within one bioregion. There has been regional plans prepared straddling a number of shires or local government areas, sorry. So bioregions are usually discussed at that level, but for these local government plans, they are usually just within one bioregion. Catchments, really, I'll talk, as Michelle said, I'll talk about catchments later, but catchments essentially just define areas, the parts of the bioregion that feed into particular watercourses. So there'll be commonality between catchments if they're in the same bioregion, but the water coming off those catchments will differ according to the relative proportion of different types of land and its condition and any local climatic differences and so on.
Thanks, Gethin. Yeah, and as Gethin said, a later session in this morning's workshop will be talking about these sort of different scales and the way that different agencies use different information. Delia has asked, is there such a thing as a rain map that shows prevailing rainfall in each bioregion? And if so, how detailed would those maps be to reflect microclimate differences?
No, the mapping's not there, but you can certainly models, if you use the Bureau of Meteorology site for those modelling maps that they've got at national and state scales, you can see how that modelling is used, but getting down to that very fine level is generally not mapped. The vegetation maps generally give a good indication of any microhabitats. It's not just, sometimes, you know, the rainforest gullies and so on might reflect fire protection due to shallowness of soils and no grass to burn or something like that, but often they do reflect just sheltered aspects out of the prevailing winds or the late afternoon sun or whatever the case may be. But no, the detailed landscape modelling, we're not there yet.
Thanks, Gethin. I actually missed an earlier question from Delia. She says, is it possible to view a current bioregion map of New South Wales online? And if so, what is the URL? Where can the public go for an explanation of the conditions in a particular New South Wales bioregion? And before you answer that, Gethin, I just want to say at the end of our workshop, we're going to try to show you the mapping tool that Ayla has been developing to actually bring the bioregions to life with the many data sets that are out there. But Gethin, you go first, and then we can talk about some of that later at the end, perhaps.
Okay, look, I haven't kept up with what the New South Wales services have been doing. I know they've been drastically cut in terms of funding and numbers of staff. I know they have put out publications covering some of the sub-regions, but I'm not sure what online mapping tools they've got. I can say in Queensland, and if there's time, and you're not familiar with it, I'll show you the Queensland Globe mapping tool. But look, I'm sorry, it would be a matter of contacting the New South Wales Environment Department or on their website first off, and if there's no mapping tool available there, contacting them directly to chase up bioregional publications.
Thank you, Gethin. I actually think it would be very valuable to save a bit of time at the end of our session today to talk about the Queensland Global map. And if we have time, I'll also show you the developing Ayla tool, because as Gethin said, there are significant amounts of data out there in the world. There are lots and lots of data sets. It's not a problem of too much info. It's a problem of trying to work out how to use that information as citizen scientists and citizen governance people. And that's what our tool's been designed to just help people understand what's going on. So I can show you a little bit of that. Rosie, who's one of our wonderful Ayla team members, has just posted, there's a link there for the Environment New South Wales website, which shows you the bioregions. And while, from what we have found, there aren't actually any interactive bioregional maps that you can kind of jump into and look about at. That's kind of what we're doing with ours. What you can find are the existing classifications of maps. And that's certainly what Rosie and Ruth and others in Ayla, we've been digging around, pulling info out of all the different state departments for all the different kinds of info about where the bioregional data is. So I hope that answers your question. And we will come back to the maps and info. Janet has asked a fascinating question to me. She says, Michelle, can we start to systematically give each of these 419 bio-subregions a legal entity and have each region managed by a governance system, by a democracy of sovereign First Nations people and those who live in the region? What an amazing and radical idea. What a radical you are, Janet. Let's chat at the end of this session about that. That comes into the space around bioregionalism, which was a particular movement that really gained interest in the 70s. And certainly there's been a lot of thinking around that by deep ecologists and environmentalists saying, wouldn't it be good if modern nation states actually thought and acted like First Nations peoples and built their own governance systems around the reality of the biophysical world and the cultural and social interactions with that place. And bioregionalism, which started in Cascadia, a bioregional space in the USA and Canada, did a lot of work around that. What we're looking at within AILA is using bioregions first and foremost as an educative tool to really show people that they can embrace their local place and understand it so they can rethink their sustainability efforts in light of what Mother Nature is telling them about their place. And by integrating that effort with connecting with the First Nations peoples of that place. But there's a lot of complexities about this being a Western tool versus Aboriginal peoples have their own boundaries, their own maps, their own regions, and Westerners, the last thing we want to do is appropriate that or copy that. So there's a lot of ways to work in partnership together to care for country and then muddle through and work out how we govern ourselves better in that place. So really would be happy to talk to you about that separately, but we might speak to it a little bit at the end of the session too. So I'm just checking now, Gethin, for other questions. Rosie and Jenny have been popping in some web links, which is terrific. Thank you. All right. Copying would be fine, stealing less so. Well, actually, Jody, it's interesting. You might, if you haven't already, I would love to invite you to join a future dreaming workshop with incredible Aboriginal people like Mary Graham, who talk about both the philosophy and the political governance system of the civilization of Aboriginal nations across the continent pre-colonisation. And she's actually an advocate for what she would call pluralism, that Aboriginal people have their culture and we can learn and be with them, but we also have good things in our culture and we should learn to care for country better and work in true partnership rather than copy everything that they do. But I guess it's a much more refined conversation and I don't pretend to speak for others at all, but I work daily with incredible Aboriginal elders on this very issue. How do we make a future for ourselves on this continent without replicating colonisation, with in fact decolonising our minds and our ways of being and trying to live in harmony together. So it's a big and complex issue. But on that deep philosophical note, Gethin, would you like a 5-minute break to grab a cup of tea before you speak with us again, or are you happy to keep rolling? Because I'm very happy for you to keep going.
Yes, no, I'm happy to keep rolling. Look, if I could just add there, not just the bioregional movement in the 70s and 80s, there was also the talk about regional government. And, you know, the 3 levels of government, federal, state and local, to be replaced by 2 levels, federal and regional. And you can imagine, you know, simplifying in terms of efficiency, but also providing an opportunity for different communities of interest that reflected more landscape and land use. And so there were, for a little while there was an opening to maybe look at aggregations of regions as a basis for those new regional governments. But I think we...
Was this during the enlightened times of Gough Whitlam?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's when the idea of the federal government funding the states with directed grants to try and encourage them in certain ways, and it hasn't gained any momentum at all. I think the inertia is too great at the moment.
I'd love to have more of this conversation with you, Gethin, and others, because even in AILA's humble response to the EPBC Act, the Federal Acts Review, we've suggested ecological community governance as replacing top-down governance, not just of country or caring for the land, but also of our socio-political structures, which is, you know, deeply radical for a continent that's locked into the state rights approach. So there are a lot of ways. And the one thing we do say as lawyers is the most malleable boundary, political boundary in Australia is the local council boundary. As many of us know, local councils are only created by state legislation. And over the past decade and a half, we saw the amalgamation of local council boundaries, the changes to local council districts, despite people coming out and marching against those initiatives by the state government. So the state government can change political boundaries at the local level. Imagine if an enlightened state government decided to rearrange some of the local councils around biophysical spaces. It would absolutely be possible, and much more possible than the immediate eradication of state boundaries or state political entities, since they came first. But yeah, again, I won't get my legal nerd on. Today is all about Gethin, but with lots of input from Ayla as an adoring fan of his work. So, well, Gethin, if you would like to move on to your next session, then I think everyone loved that. And then after Gethin runs through this next section of material, we'll have more time for questions. Thank you so much, Gethin.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm just having trouble with my mouse yet again. I'll just see if
That's okay, take your time. If you want to stop sharing and then set it up and share again, you just do whatever you want.
Well, I would if I could find my mouse.
Just keep moving it. The cursor will become, will make itself. You can see the National Reserve System map, if that's of any help.
I'm on the right thing. I've just got to find the mouse to get the slide up. I really thought I'd fix this, but I'm not there yet.
It's okay. Once Zoom comes onto a screen, it can get very complicated. A lot of people lose track of their buttons and things.
Okay. It's working. Oh, there it is. We're back in.
Well done.
Okay. So just to go into a bit more detail, the differences between the different levels of the hierarchy and the different terms being used. So at the moment, the land classification hierarchy is not consistent internationally. Different nations use different terminologies. And even within Australia, there's still a lot of terms used interchangeably. A term commonly used is the biome. And that's essentially vegetation related. So it's extensive areas larger than a bioregion that delineate the broad structural patterns of vegetation. So the eastern forests, the shrublands of the inland and so on. So they're very broad groups. And because they're vegetation based, they're really not part of the integrated land classification hierarchy. In Australia, the largest unit within that integrated framework is the ecoregion, and this is one attempt to define what those ecoregions might be. So it reflects broad patterns of structurally similar vegetation in the same way that a biome does, but it's pinned onto the bioregion. So it brings in that climatic and landscape basis as well. So they're used at a much larger scale. So I think this one's about 1 to 15,000, 1 to 15 million rather. So we've got the deserts and the shrublands, the dry shrublands here. We've got the mixed eucalypt forests here, the montane areas down on the Alps here, the rainforest areas here, and so on. So it's useful for looking at an international map of vegetation or something, I suppose, or broad landscapes around the world, but at a national scale, you'd go straight to bioregions or fauna. Another way that they've been grouped in Australia is agroclimatic zones. So this is from a report on climate change, the impact of climate change on the National Reserve System. And what they've done is group the subregions into larger groupings that help to identify continental scale climate change issues that are related to landscape features like seasonal growth, droughtiness, fire hazard, those sort of things that are really going to start to hit biodiversity. So again, they're useful at a national and international scale, but at a national scale, you drill down within those agroclimatic zones to look at individual bioregions. So back to this map here. The getting down to bioregions again, so we've got the ecozones and the agroclimatic zones. The next one down is the bioregion. So we map them at 1 to 1 million or larger and use them primarily for national and state assessments. They've been primarily used for conservation assessment and planning, and particularly a representative conservation reserve system. But of course, being integrated units, they're far more useful than just that. Initially, we called them natural regions, and then biophysical regions, they were called after that, because natural just seemed, I think, a bit fluffy. So they were called biophysical, so that reflects the biological and the physical characteristics. And then eventually it was abbreviated to bioregions, and the physical sort of dropped off and tends to be forgotten because a lot of the mapping is done by botanists. And then the bioregions are divided into subregions, and prior to subregions being adopted nationally, they were called in Queensland and New South Wales provinces. And in the book of Queensland ecosystems, they're still called provinces because it was put out in 1999 and the terminology shifted to the national terminology after that. So subregions are based on the associated ecosystem. So this subregion here of the alluvial fans, this subregion down around the edge of the Gulf Plains where you get tidal and sand dune systems occurring, another subregion there. And then within those subregions, the land system, within the land system, the land unit. And that's the smallest part of the hierarchy. So land units you would map at 1 to 25,000 or smaller. So just to go a little bit further into this, up in Cape York, you can see this land system Beluga is also occurring down here. This bioregional boundary that comes around off up here, the Cape York bioregion up here has got a maritime climate. As you know, Cape York sort of narrows and gets a maritime influence from the east and the west. When you come to that same land system down here, it's behind the Ironsley uplands, behind the Great Dividing Range, and it's in a rain shadow, so it's much drier. So although the land system is mapped the same, there are quite, and the soils, because they formed over geological time, are very similar too. But the vegetation, it's an example of what's going to happen with climate change. The vegetation has dried out over time and is just that much lower and more open, even though the floristics are similar. So it's part of a different bioregion. It's part of the Gulf Plains. Regional ecosystems are outside this hierarchical classification. They were devised to provide a scale of land classification between the two, because land systems are complex and land units are too small to map at a state scale. So regional ecosystems were devised to just try and find the happy medium that could be consistently mapped using air photos. So they had to be patterns that you could actually recognize on air photos. So they've ended up as aggregations of closely related land units. And I'll go into that in more detail later. So bioregions and the various subunits are useful for understanding landscapes and their processes. But to understand watercourses, we need to look at catchments. So the boundaries between catchments are called watersheds. So the water flows to either side of a watershed. And so they're usually represented by low rises, hills, ranges, things like that. So adjacent catchments in a bioregion will have similar biophysical characteristics, but the different extents in each catchment of the different types of land and the way those lands are managed will lead to in-stream differences in what would otherwise appear to be similar catchments. And particularly for water quality issues such as from contaminants coming from agricultural mining. And then there will also be differences in water quality between catchments and hydrology in general, because of differences in condition of ground cover, degree of soil degradation, erosion, and so on. The biota of watercourses, even though they're within the same bioregion, may also differ according to the hydrology of that particular catchment, so its size, for example, and its particular local climate. And that biota will also relate evolutionary back to how that catchment related to previous catchments. So as you get as you get geological change with changing patterns of land and erosion. So for example, on this map, as I said earlier, these alluvial systems down here were eroded largely from the Great Artesian Basin, which used to extend way to the east of the Australian seaboard, of the Queensland seaboard in this area. So, and then there was a major faulting up through the eastern side, and most of that part of Queensland went off to sea to form the Queensland Plateau, the marine plateau. So when you look at that scale of landscape change, you can see how catchments, the association between catchments and the biota they share changes. And then depending how long those catchments are stable, the biota evolves accordingly. But within a catchment, the physical features of those freshwater aquatic ecosystems, such as, the rockiness of the base and the way, whether it's a smooth or rough or pebbly or whatever, will also reflect the characteristics of the bioregion or subregion. And similarly, the offshore and estuarine areas. And I gave the example yesterday of Townsville. We've got these broad coastal plains, and then they're reflected by big alluvial mudflats, which are now marine or estuarine mudflats offshore. Whereas you go up the coast to the wet tropics and you've got the rocky shorelines and not much in the way of mudflats offshore. Historically, most data to do with land use, so, number, stock and so on, that's been collated within administrative or political regions or divisions, state government, local government areas, electoral divisions and so on. But of course, the broad range of landscapes within each of those, as we were talking about earlier, means that those values are averaged across a very broad range of landscapes, and it's very hard to pin down which aspects within that subdivision are changing. So it comes back to why landscape units are so important for monitoring change and planning. Okay, so I hope that clarifies some of the broad differences within land classification. I'd like to now go into regional ecosystems in a bit more detail, because they are so important in Queensland and they are now widely respected in Australia. And in most states, there's a desire to do what Queensland and Western Australia has in terms of integrated base units. So the problem we found with the integrated land classification hierarchy was that the most useful one, the most detailed one, the land unit, is too small to feasibly map, and the land system is too heterogeneous. So we needed a different approach for a uniform statewide map to inform policy and legislation and so on. So to be really useful, it still had to be an integrated approach, and we still needed it to be within the bioregional framework. This need came to a head in 1989 when I did a report on conservation needs in the Brigalow Belt for the Queensland government. So it was again to guide the development of a representative reserve system, but there was also the political imperative that if we were to systematically increase reserve extent, we need to have a similar increase in the proportion of represented ecosystems, or if you like, a decrease in the unrepresented ecosystems. And if we map too finely, or if the land classification was too fine, the increasing number of ecosystems being identified would just swamp any gains in representation in conservation reserves. So there was not just the practicality of mapping, there was also the pragmatic aspects of politics.
Excuse me, Gethin, can I just check? We're still looking at the map in the Carpentaria. Is that still the one on your screen? Oh, good. I just wasn't sure if I'd missed something. Okay.
There's a lot of talking there, and I'm about to change now.
No, that's okay. Just if you choose different options in the share screen, you can think that you're moving through them, but we don't see them. So I just want to check. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so the compromise we reached was to group land units with similar geomorphological and vegetation characteristics. So there was a losing of some detail. There was a loss of context. So by looking at two different land systems and saying, oh, there's a lot of this land unit here, there's a little bit of it in that one, they're pretty similar, let's group them. So there was, the context was lost. And then we also looked, or I also looked across sub-regions, so that there might be an outlier of that land system in the next sub-region. And so a land unit from there might be grouped. So the sub-regional boundaries were lost in the regional ecosystem framework too. So there was in fact a tremendous loss of context, but the unit itself still remains very useful. So this is from that 1989 report. So these are the different land zones based on geology, landform and soils. So for instance, land zone 1 is alluvial plains. Land zone 2 is colluvial deposits. So that's the stuff, whereas alluvial deposits are water laid, they're along the major water courses. The colluvial deposits is the stuff that gathers at the foot of big slopes. So it's more to do with gravity than water. So if we look down at, say, Brigalow down here, Acacia harpophylla, as a vegetation association, it occurs in Province 31 as major ecosystem 1. It occurs in Province 31 again as major ecosystem 2. So there's been two grouped there. And then it was also in Province 33 as major ecosystem 13. And these are the land systems. So it was recorded in Province 33 over a number of land systems. So you can see a tremendous grouping there. If we just go to Province 31, here they are here, 1 and 2. They're both colluvials from Jurassic shale, so they have that in common. One's lower slopes, one's stony slopes, so they'll be a bit higher. The lower slopes will have washed out from here. One's deep cracking clays, one's not quite so deep. They're both Brigalow. One's got an understory of Wilga, Gidgee, Eremophila and bull oak. The other one has got Bauhinia underneath it. So you can see there are significant differences, but the landscape overall, the soils, the slope, the origin, the dominant species are all common. So that's where we ended up with the regional ecosystem. And from the 1999 book, this is an explanation of Sattler and Williams, the bioregions and regional ecosystems of Queensland. This is how it works. So within the bioregions, we could separate out the provinces or the subregions, and then via land systems down to the land type, which was the different land units grouped, which then formed the regional ecosystems. So where land system was mapping, that was mapping was available. That was the path we could follow. We could follow to define regional ecosystems, and that of course is in the context of not having the regional ecosystem mapping available. Just using the land system mapping, we could derive the regional ecosystems known to be present on the current level of information. Most of those original regional ecosystems have now been greatly refined on the basis of the state mapping. Coming from the other side, and this is the path that the mappers followed once the mapping got underway, they divided the bioregions into land zones, and then the land zones were divided into regional ecosystems. I mean, you could divide the land zones into finer units, but basically this is what they mapped. Now, one thing that has been a saving grace in a way of the RE mapping was that some of the mappers really had a good eye, and you've got to bear in mind it was a massive mapping program. There are a variety of skills and knowledge, and so there's a bit of variety still in the mapping standards, but the land zone was hopefully the thing that would pull people together. Some people identified very fine units to group up into regional ecosystems, and those finer units were retained as what was initially called land types, but are currently called vegetation associations, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. So essentially, the regional ecosystem has a subunit that's not often used called the vegetation unit. So I'll just now talk about land zones. It's unfortunately a bit small at this scale. So land zones are the framework for breaking up the bioregions for the mapping purposes for the state. So it kept the integrated geomorphological framework of subregions, but it ignored the boundaries of the subregions. It grouped similar things across the boundaries into their geomorphic similarities. So at the highest level, we've got the unconsolidated deposits or the consolidated bedrock. So the hard rock versus the soft rock. The unconsolidated, you can divide into coastal or inland. The coastal you can divide into the estuarine, the stuff that has a marine influence, so the mangroves, the salt pans, salt cooch and so on. And then the coastal dunes and swales, so the Pleistocene dunes like Cooloola and Fraser Island, and then the younger dunes that you get along around the coast of most of Australia. So that's that's land zone 1 and 2. So they're the coastal ones. The inland unconsolidated, you've got fine textured soils or you've got coarse textured soils. So the fine textured soils are either alluvial deposits or these are interesting. These are old lake bed deposits from the tertiary. So you get them all up through the Brigalow belt, and they're the dominant clay soils that Brigalow used to occur on. So before the Fitzroy River could flow out at Rockhampton, cut through the ranges there, that whole Fitzroy Basin was a big inland lake. So these clay deposits were laid down as lake deposits. When the river cut through the ranges and down cut back through these clay plains, they became a more undulating sort of a landscape. So that's the fourth one, and we can work through them, and so you get down to the hard rock. So down here you've got the granites, here you've got the volcanic rocks, the basalts and so on. Here you've got the folded rocks of the big eastern geosynclines, steep slopes, shallow soils. These are your horizontally bedded sandstones. These are your horizontally bedded shale, fine textured rocks. And these ones are tertiary residual land around Winton and places like that. And you see these lovely mesas with the hard cappings. That's the ironstone capping. There used to be deep red soils over it. All the iron in those deep soils was leached through, deposited on the top of the underlying bedrock, and it wasn't always iron. Sometimes it was silica, and you end up with these hard cappings of ironstone or a silicious layer, silcrete, on top. So really hard, stony, very sparse vegetation. So they're in the maiden land zones, and you can see they're quite distinct landscapes. And if they're broken up by the vegetation and associated soils and landform, it's still a good integrated approach to land classification. Now, it does, however, draw attention to how important it is that when you're mapping or understanding landscapes, that you correctly identify the land zone, because if you get the land zone wrong, you're way off course and nothing else is going to be right. And one of the risks of handing the mapping over to the herbarium was that they were predominantly botanists. A lot of them didn't want to map, they just wanted to do plants. So it took quite a while for the mapping process to unfold, suitable people to get into place, skills to be learnt, and so on. So the maps have evolved over time. There were definitional issues that would always pop up and needed to be resolved. And to cope with that, there were a couple of levels of oversight established between the group that I worked for, which was the Conservation Strategy Group, and other statewide scientists, and then the Herbarium Group. And we also brought in external experts as needed. So we had one group that would look at statewide issues. So this was bioregional boundaries. If one mapper on one side of the boundary decided that the bioregion boundary needed to be shifted, it was that group that resolved the issues, and it was that group that looked at the land zone definitional issues. And then within the bioregion, there was another group that would look at the detailed bioregional mapping and make sure it was consistent and so on within the bioregion. And one of the long-running problems we had was that the alluvials, land zone 3, were always meant, in my mind, to be, and in the mind of some others, were always meant to be the youngest ones. And it was an important distinction because these were the active flooded areas. If you wanted to produce a map of areas liable to be flooded in Queensland, all you had to do was print out land zone 3, and there was your map of flood liable country. You could then subdivide that according to the nature of the vegetation, which reflected the frequency and perhaps even depth of flooding. So it was a powerful way for identifying also habitat. These are generally the more fertile parts of the landscape, better developed vegetation, more important for fauna. So if you wanted to work out how much of a fringing vegetation was cleared, here was the category to start looking at. So in working out threat, a good recognition of these richer areas was really needed. What happened, unfortunately, is that the geology mapping didn't get down to this sort of scale. It would map QA, Quaternary alluvial, so it would cover everything from the really old, hard Pleistocene or earlier alluvial deposits of alluvial origin, but they no longer functioned as alluvial system. The rivers had cut down through them, and the current alluvial system was just a narrow cutting through that old plain. That old plain should have gone down here into the 5, the coarser textured, near level uniform sand plains. That's where it would normally be. So there has always been a trouble with 3 and 5, and I'll talk about a bit more about that later. So this is just a page from the Sattler and Williams 1999 Queensland Ecosystems book. So we've got a number, we've got a supplementary description. So this is what they're based on: land system mapping, John Neldner's vegetation mapping, DPI mapping. You know, so it integrated all these data sets into a single unit. But you could go back to here for the original information. There was a general description here. The provinces or sub-regions, so you can see this is a very widespread one, which protected areas contain them, the extent, the original extent of that ecosystem, how much was conserved, so we had various classes. This one's low, a bit of comment about them, how much remains, 15%, and then a conservation status. So with such a low, less than 10 to 30, anyway, conservation status. Now, I won't get into the two different statuses. There's a Vegetation Management Act status, which simply reflects the original extent and how much has been cleared. And there was the conservation status, which was also incorporated, on the one hand, the extent, but it also incorporated the condition. So even though there was 15% remaining, which, you know, when you're looking at a terribly fragmented and disturbed ecosystem, is not very much, and then when it's also been overgrazed and there's very little understory, you end up with a conservation status of endangered. So that's the level of information that we were able to pull together just from existing sources with the strength of the sub-regional and bioregional framework. And this then laid the framework for the detailed mapping that followed. And so this is a terrible thing to look at, but it's just an indication of the data set that you can now access for all the regional ecosystems. So I can't zoom in, but there's things like the full description plus any subtypes. There's a short description. There's protected areas. There's the sub-region it occurs in. There's recommendations on fire management. There's general comments about it. There's wetland characteristics. There's a whole lot of information that you can now search once you know what ecosystem you're talking about. So of course what it means is that any of these single attributes can now be displayed in a map. So if you want to display wetlands, here's your column. You can classify the different types of wetlands and produce a wetland map straight from the regional ecosystem map. You can look at fire recommendations. Anything else that can be tied to a polygon can now be represented that way. So for example, the way the Environment Department ended up going were these things called biodiversity planning assessments, where they gathered together a group of flora experts and have a workshop and pick their brains, update all the threatened species listings, all the names of the different species, any changes that occurred, where their habitat was, any species that were poorly known, any new species that were on the cards that needed to be known about. Same thing for animals too, so plants and animals. And then a separate group, again, for landscape issues. So salinity, areas of particular significance for biodiversity, and so on and so forth. All that information was integrated through GIS, plus a lot of other computer-driven metrics about size and distance and viability and so on, to end up with this overarching assessment of value. And this is the sort of information that now is built to a greater or lesser extent into local government plans. Whether or not it's well implemented, I won't buy into. So we end up with the light blue is state habitat for EV, endangered, vulnerable and near threatened taxa. The dark blue is of state significance. The green is regional significance, and the brown is local significance. And you can see most of that's state significance because of koala habitat and other species, or because of status, because there's been so much clearing, there's so little left, it's all considered of state significance. We've also used the mapping, of course, as I said, for identifying essential habitat, which is protected under the Vegetation Management Act. So one of the early data sets we prepared up in Townsville was the mahogany glider and cassowary essential habitat maps, and that all fed into the regional planning up there. Now, one of the questions I was asked on Wednesday was the largest scale map available for showing bioregional boundaries. And I should have mentioned Queensland Globe, an initiative of the state government to make all these data sets publicly available. And it's a really good system. And if and when there's time, Michelle, I'd like to just quickly give people a run through on it. It's not difficult to use, and there is a tutorial to help you use it. But perhaps if there's time later, we'll look at it. This is all I've got.
That would be great, Gethin, and we can show people some of the bits and pieces we've been finding too. So thank you.
All right. Okay, well, look, that's all I've got for this session. So if there's any questions, perhaps we can move on to them.
Thank you, Gethin. I was actually just answering one comment from Andrew about his artistic research, looking at mapping, which is exciting from Ayla's point of view. We have a program, so I'll just reply to Andrew. Sorry, you caught me in the middle of replying. I'll send you my email address, Andrew. But in terms of comments and questions, we have Jane actually asked a question about, but she thinks it might have been answered in some of your discussions around, I think, land zones, but I'll repeat it. Jane has asked, climate change is having a huge impact in the Northern Territory and Queensland on mangroves. How are coastal and waterway hugging mangroves dealt with in a bioregional mapping sense? And I wonder, Gethin, if you can speak to the IBRA version that included some marine bioregions, or maybe that was not something you were involved in.
I was peripherally involved with that because they were interested in the concepts used, but of course the marine concepts are slightly different. I mean, I suppose instead of climate, you've got currents and water depth. There is, as I mentioned, an influence from the adjacent bioregions, so they were built, that was built into a certain degree, but ultimately it was developed separately. But the question regarding mangroves, they were treated as, sort of semi-terrestrial, so they were included in the RE mapping. So all those estuarine ecosystems, so the fringing mangroves down along the estuaries or the lower reaches of the rivers, the tidal reaches of the rivers, and the shore-hugging salt couch that tends to be the first zone you go through, and then maybe the samphire zone, and then so there's REs for samphires, and then the hypersaline salt flats. So they're mapped as an RE, and then the mangrove, the different communities are mapped. Sometimes they're not differentiated very much, but if they are identifiable on air photos, there's a number of varieties of mangrove ecosystems.
That's excellent. There was another question, I think it was earlier on, and it related to asking about, are there maps that we can look to? And I know I've got different maps, but is there something that can show us the ecoregion, bioregion, subregion, land zone, something that actually shows non-scientists who might not be familiar with these classifications, how it all fits together?
Well, the ecoregion map I showed you from memory, I'll just go back up to that first one. So the ecoregion map there, as you can see the subregions, you can see the bioregions within that region map. So that's on the NRS page of the Federal Environment Department. And
So, sorry, Gethin, so those ecoregions, can I just clarify? I've seen a map of the world that shows all of the ecoregions, and I think it was Worldwide Fund for Nature, or someone did that research. Is that the same ecoregions? Can we kind of trust that? Okay.
I believe so. This map is based on Worldwide Fund for Nature's mapping. Yep.
Cool.
So they've grouped the bioregions here. So on this map, you can see both levels. And on this map, it's not the eco regions, unfortunately, but in this one, it does show the sub-regions and bioregions. So getting back to this one, you can produce the map. It's just a GIS exercise, so it's easy enough to do. You just need access to the data sets. So I don't believe the state hold these ecoregion data sets. So that would be through the NRS site. So you could certainly from the NRS site, and I haven't looked at the land and water audit site recently, but there used to be a heap of data sets available from there too. But all these things have been squeezed for funds, and I'm just not sure how well they're being maintained anymore. So certainly from the NRS site, the data should be there to produce an ecoregion, overlying bioregion, overlying subregion. The land zones are a state data set, so you'd have to go to the Queensland Globe to access that one.
Yes. I might take over screen just for 1 second, Gethin, and show people the global ecoregion map. I don't know if it's the definitive one, but I quickly called it up. Population. It might not be. No, that looks about the right one. If you look at the ecoregions.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's the right one.
Yep.
Yeah. So from what we understand, WWF did this huge body of work. So the planet has ecoregions, and so it's quite lovely if you're a map nerd like I am. I don't understand half of the information, but I like to look at maps, the fractal way that they look at ecoregions, and then the bioregions inside Australia, then the subregions. So anyway, I'll stop sharing.
That's a lovely map. That really gives a good picture.
Yeah, and it just shows how much work people are doing around the world to understand from a Western scientific knowledge approach where life is and what bits of life are in trouble and what we have to do to care for them. So, Gethin, did you want to share screen again and just bring that map back up in case we have any other questions, or you might be sick of sharing screen?
Yeah, oops, yeah. No, that's okay.
Yeah. Andrew has asked, referring to the Queensland document that defines the land zone mapping philosophy, are you aware of a similar document for New South Wales? I'm particularly interested in the Hunter Valley and local coast.
No, there isn't a... the New South Wales haven't put the effort into this sort of work. It's interesting. They moved more towards modelling. So they established a pretty strong GIS unit early on, and I tried to use some of their mapping for the bioregions and subregions of eastern New South Wales, the tablelands and coast, and the maps they produced for me were just muddy coloured. So all the floristic associations, for example, were mapped at essentially a pixel scale. But because it was modelling, they were at such a fine scale that all the different colours merged and you just couldn't use them. So they don't use the land zone framework, and they don't use that air photo field sampling, that really intensive way of mapping. They have got it for some parts of the state, but they haven't done a uniform state mapping program yet. As far as the Hunter Valley goes, CSIRO, one of their land use study reports covers the Hunter Valley, and I use that one for my New South Wales work, and that's certainly one to get hold of. I could chase up the reference for that if needed.
I would actually like that, Gethin, if you could if you could find that, particularly because Ayla is linking the mapping project we're doing under Greenprints to the emerging new economy hubs, and the Hunter Newcastle hub within the new economy space is interested in learning more about the Greenprints approach. So it's certainly a region of interest for the work we do, and I can certainly share that with Andrew, or if you email him directly, that would be terrific.
Right. Yep. Now I'll dig that up.
Very good. If anyone else has questions, do feel free to unmute and speak with your voice as I try to find other ones. Andrew has just said thank you. What else have we got in here? Actually, Jodie's made a nice comment. She put, this reminds me of a conversation I've been following regarding geotourism advocacy, which is arguing for boosting federal protection of geological education forms. That sounds intense, very old school.
Well, yes, interestingly enough, in Queensland in the early 70s and running into the 80s, the Geological Society of Queensland was very interested in geological, well, just for want of a better term, geological monuments, but certainly geological areas of interest. And they identified and described a wide range of really interesting geological elements, formations, exposures, you know, landscapes, all sorts of things across the state, fossil localities, you know, which they attempted to get protected through the national estate listings, which have also sort of succumbed to economic rationalisation. So, you know, but the original documents are still there in various libraries, and they're a wonderful source of information.
Thank you. Vishal has said, I have used the Queensland Globe before in my site for species evaluation on a regional buffer zone, but when the real study was done, it seemed to be misleading with some of the species. Not sure if you can comment on that, Gethin?
No, not really. The biodiversity planning assessments are really the best place to chase species information for a bioregion, because it's the most up-to-date peer-reviewed data available, really, and I'm not sure how well that interacts with the data you're accessing through Queensland Globe. You can access the BPAs, the biodiversity planning assessments, through Queensland Globe. I'm not sure, but you'd have to access the expert reports separately.
Very good. I may be going over ground again, Gethin, but again, for the non-scientist sitting in front of you, me, can you just give me some examples of how different NRM groups or agencies within state governments, etc., use different scales for different purposes? I know that you've touched on it already, but so for example, the folks who use catchment management groups are catchment management authorities, and some of them created by statute in Victoria. NRM bodies in Australia seem to be, in Queensland, seem to be wrapped around a different scale again, but can you just talk from your own experience who uses which kind of scale?
Well, first I'd just like to say the catchment versus bioregion. For a while there, it looked like we were going to have NRM groups based on bioregions, but ultimately the catchments won out because their main concern was water quality, and you know, because the early groups were sort of coastal and you know, eastern groups, they were more interested in the impacts, and particularly in northern Queensland, central and northern Queensland, impacts on the reef. So they ended up going down the catchment route for subdivisions. Because they're primarily dealing with landholders, and when they've got a landholder focus, they tend to be more interested in groupings of regional ecosystems. So they're more interested in you know, the ironbark communities, or you know, the rainforest areas, or the alluvial fringes, or whatever. So they tend not to dig down into the detail. They're more concerned with impacts of land use and water quality. So
Actually, thank you. And in April, on April the 18th, our Greenprints program, we're working with the Sunshine Coast community, a number of community groups to actually roll out some of these ideas of how you take a step-by-step process through bioregions out into human activities in the economy. And one of the folks involved with an NRM group said a similar sort of thing. She said, because I asked her about this difference between bioregions and catchments, she said, look, bioregions are the best way to find out about, as I said, Mother Nature's way of telling us about herself. She said, but if you want to engage people, it's often the catchments, the waterways, the monitoring of water that people are building a lot of their land care projects around. So it seemed a comment that didn't take away anything from using bioregions as a center point for our work. So that was actually really great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like using a furry animal to drive landscape management, you know, because it catches people's attention. It's the same thing with the waterways. You know, people are very aware of what's happening in waterways. Because most land is privately held, you don't really have access to understand what's going on in those places, and it's only when you on private land, if you like. So it's only when you do a lot of work with remote sensing, with satellite imagery and air photos, and you start to look at data that addresses change. You know, like the tree clearing, for instance, from the Department of Natural Resources and Mines website. You can access this thing called SLATS, State Land and Trees Study, that maps every year or two where the clearing's happening across the state, and the type of land that's being cleared and the changing proportions of regrowth and so on and so forth. So it's only when you start to look at that sort of information that you start to be concerned about the landscape itself rather than the downstream impact.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's actually really helpful. If there are no other questions for that session, we might, I think, Gethin, just on humane grounds, I should let you have a tea break. Would you like a 5-10 minute break, or would you genuinely prefer to roll through and keep chatting?
5 minutes would be good. Give everyone a time for a drink and whatever else.
Okay, that'd be lovely. So look, it's 11:31. Let's aim to get up and stretch. And can I please urge on behalf of, you know, a fellow human being who spends a lot of time sitting, that you do all get up and have a walk around. Let's reconvene at 11:38. No, 11:40. That will give you time to boil the kettle if you need to. 11:40, my lovely people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The link will stay open. You're welcome to stay on. You don't have to jump off and come back on. So. I will pause record, however. Excellent. Thanks to everyone for coming back after our little break. Gethin, would you like to get started on the next and final session for our masterclass? Thank you.
Certainly. So this last session, I just want to talk around using regional ecosystems for planning and for increasing environmental awareness, because, you know, a picture is 1,000 words basically, and maps can be very powerful. So so to do this, I'm going to use the desert uplands as a case study. So the desert uplands was the first bioregion that regional ecosystem mapping was completed for, and the first one to have the review to tie it all together and finalise it, and that we were therefore able to start regional planning for that bioregion way back in 2000, not long after 2000. The mapping was finally available in 2002, and that's when this study was completed. So the desert uplands is this area just here in the middle of Queensland. It's been called the roof of Queensland because a little bit runs off down into the Gulf. A lot of it runs down into the Channel Country and Lake Eyre. and it runs down into the Fitzroy, and it also runs down into the Burdekin. So it covers most of the major catchments of Queensland. It's an interesting interesting bioregion because it's the largest remnant of the old tertiary plateau that used to cover most of inland Queensland. All those little mesas you see out west with the red tops on them, they're remnants. No soil left on top, just a little bit of the hard stuff left. This is the intact surface with the deep red soil still, and it's even got a couple of lakes, Lake Buchanan, Lake Galilee on it, internal drainage basin lakes, which is why this corridor goes either side. The Great Divide separates here, goes up one side, goes up the other, and in the depression, in the middle, you've got these lakes. On the western side, you've got the Mitchell Grass Downs. So this is the shales that cap the Great Artesian Basin. On the eastern side, you've got all the developed lands of the Brigalow Belt. And to the north, you've got the Arnesley Uplands, a lovely complex plateau system. The Great Artesian Basin then margin runs all the way down through here, and this orange line is a corridor following the sandstone ranges around the rim of the Great Artesian Basin. So the Carnarvons are around here. And those ranges are the last, through this part of the world with the grasslands here, the clearing there, this is the last link of woodlands, the last woodland corridor joining all the way down into New South Wales, all the way up to Cape York through the inland. As you'll know on the coast, this corridor that's been identified on the coast is broken in quite a few places by clearing and needs a bit of work of reconnectivity. Inland, this is it. So here's a map of the land zones. These yellow soils here, land zone 5, they're the deep red soils that are the original soils of the tertiary plateau. And they're so old and it's such a large area that they still harbour a heap of endemic and threatened plant species. The name desert uplands, refers to the poor quality of the grazing lands. It was seen by the people to the east in the Brigalow Belt and to the west in the Mitchell Grass Downs as desert. And there was poison bush through it too, which inhibited its grazing value and so on. But the sandy soils are derived from the sandstones that underlie it. So again, the margin of the Great Artesian Basin is where the sandstones outcrop. And here's where they're all deeply weathered, giving you these deep soils. So there's 4 subregions. There's this eastern area here, this western area here. And this was one of the very few new areas that came out from the more recent mapping. When I moved to Townsville in 1990, this was where the clearing was going to happen. All these alluvial soils through here, there was suddenly 500,000 hectares of clearing application. And I went out to have a look and we didn't see it on rakes. I don't know where we went with it, but it turned out to be this lovely intact alluvial landscape. And that's where we kicked off with the local tree clearing guidelines back in 1990. So it's mainly an alluvial landscape. The orange here is outcropping ferrocrete, so that the land zone 7. And these soils were actually derived, the old Flinders River used to come down through here before it got captured and went off to the Gulf. So these are basalt-derived alluvials, very fertile. These alluvials down here are derived from the White Mountains, so they're poorer soils, they're prone to salinity and so on. So even though they're all coloured blue, there's quite big differences in the origin of them. And so that's an issue with the land zones. They're they're not a monolithic unit. I mean, alluvial plains can come from a number of sources, and they'll all be different. They'll all end up with different soils and different patterns, even though they're all grouped into the one land zone. The second land system is the Alice tableland. So it's the main extent of the sandstones and the deep soils overlying them. The third region, a sub-region, is the Cape Campaspe Plains. So this, you can see, extends almost over to Charters Towers. It was originally grouped with the Brigalow Belt, but when we got the more detailed mapping in and showed that floristically it was closer to the desert uplands, it was grouped here. These are those old alluvial plains I was talking about. They're now got drainage depressions through them and entrenched, but they're underlain by hardpan, and they're quite old. And then the fourth sub-region, more recently delineated again, is the country around Jericho and Alpha. That's mainly outwash sands, and it's been very heavily cleared. So to do the planning work that I'm just about to delve into, there was two other studies that we initiated from the Townsville office. One was an intensive fauna survey undertaken by Alex Cutt, and he ended up doing a PhD on it. And the other one was a more detailed assessment of land capability. So we used the REs as a framework, and we got a 3-year program underway to work with landholders and examine how what the constraints on land use were for the different regional ecosystems. So before we dive in, we're just a quick refresh for those who aren't too familiar with it. We'll be talking about regional ecosystems. So we've got the bioregions. Within the bioregions, you can identify geomorphic categories. And within those geomorphic categories, there are patterns of vegetation and soils and landform. They're mapped and described as regional ecosystems. The regional ecosystem has a number. It's identified by a number, a three-piece number. The first number is the bioregion, so 10 is the desert uplands. The second number is the land zone, so 10 is sandstones. That's this one here, plateaus, scarps and ranges on quartzose sandstones. And then the last number is the regional ecosystem. So in this case, 10-10-4, rusty jacket, Corimba larkardii, woodland with acacia understory on sandy soils, in fact skeletal sandy soils on sandstone ranges. Now, I did mention a subunit of the regional ecosystem, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So this subunit is called the vegetation unit because it is primarily vegetation. Being botanists, that's the first thing, not just that they are interested in, it's also the first thing that you see on the air photos, of course. And to find out more about the landscape, you've got to delve into the geology maps and the soil maps and they're all different scales and they all use different, and you've got to try and piece them all together to get an understanding of the vegetation pattern you're seeing on the air photo. So they were under a lot of pressure to map quickly, and vegetation was just naturally given more dominance. So in this case, we've got, it's all mapped as 1139, so that's silver-leafed ironbark on sandy alluvials. Well, in fact, as I said, this top area here is a sandy component come from the Flinders. This sand down here has come from White Mountains. These sand sheets here have been eroded from adjacent sandstone, so they're just little alluvial fans coming off the big sandstone areas and so on. So there's a lot of internal variation. The green areas are 39A, so the subunits are reflected by an A or a B or a C subscript. So 39A is silver-leafed ironbark, Eucalyptus melaniflora. So that's the lovely round opposite leaves that you see in central Queensland, and extends way down into southeast Queensland in the drier areas. The red is a silver-leafed ironbark, but it's a narrower form, and in fact it's a different species. It's Eucalyptus whitei. But because of the similarity of the location and so on, and the difference is due to aridity, the subregions, as you can see, pick it up very neatly. But at a bioregional scale, the mappers decided to lump these two species and all the variety within them into one regional ecosystem, but you can still pull apart those two types. So you can use those two types separately to show different things. The other thing that you can see here is a dark green and a light green. So the dark green is where the silver-leafed ironbark is the dominant component of the map unit, and the pale green is where the silver-leafed ironbark is a subdominant unit. So it's only maybe 5, 10, 30% of the mapped unit. It's occurring as a complex, and they've just put it there, so it gives you a bit of extra information, but it's not the dominant part of that mapped unit. So this is where we went to use the regional ecosystems. So we went down to the scale of vegetation unit. Down one path, we looked at which REs were restricted, you know, either of limited extent or to a particular subregion or part of a subregion. We looked at the REs that were threatened either because they were heavily cleared or subject to clearing, or because they were restricted and in an area of clearing, they could be quite easily lost. And we did the same with veg units. And we also identified other areas significant for biodiversity. So the lakes were an obvious feature. There's a whole lot of other areas that we knew or found through the detailed analysis. So having identified those as significant for biodiversity, they fed in as a constraint to land use. And then coming down the other side, we grouped regional ecosystems with similar geophysical characteristics. So they had similar land use capabilities and they had similar constraints to use. And those groupings we called land management units. So there might be half a dozen or a dozen regional ecosystems, all on shallow stony soils. The different vegetation as far as land use goes isn't important. The important thing is that they have skeletal soils. And then we fed them into the constraints map too, and that we end up then with a bioregional map, but with the scale of mapping and the strength of GIS, you can of course pull them out at any scale. So we were actually able to pull out property scale maps with recommendations. So most of the bioregion has got those sandy, infertile soils. And a lot of the alluvial soils are of pretty poor quality. They're texture contrast soils, so they're very prone to being hardened by hooves, and once they start gullying, they disperse underneath and fall to bits. So it's an extremely vulnerable bioregion. So a lot of the ecosystems do have a threatened status, a biodiversity status of endangered or of concern, because they are so degraded. So the red ones are endangered. The reason they're endangered is, you can see that polygon in the middle there is Lake Buchanan. And because it's so enclosed by this surrounding country, an internal drainage basin, it's like the inland lakes and plains with lunettes, with a surrounding associated system. So with the easterlies, there's all these parallel dunes and swamps and everything associated with the margins, and to a lesser extent, over geological time, as the winds have changed and so on, we've ended up with a limited sand dunes around here too. So there's a whole suite of species, and in fact, an endemic shrub around that lake. And similarly down here, there's salt discharge. It's a very salty landscape. It's so strongly leached there's a heap of salt in the profile, and wherever that profile is exposed, the salt comes out, and you get these spring systems and salt systems around the margins. And being salty in a essentially infertile landscape, the cattle rush for the salt, the salty plants, the nutrient content, and so these areas are scalded, not just through overgrazing, but because they're naturally prone to scalding with the salt. So these are the ones that are threatened by overgrazing, essentially, not so much clearing. Now, it doesn't mean that all these areas are of equal value. You know, let's protect them all. That's not the case at all. They're all degraded. The issue is they're of concern, and we erected that category at this stage. This is before the Vegetation Management Act adopted a similar system. They were of concern because we needed to get in and find out if there was anywhere still that had a better, you know, a wider biodiversity remaining. There was still worth chasing and getting better management over. Up here, this will come up a few times. This is the White Mountains National Park, and it's unusual because the underlying Galilee Basin outcrops up here in the White Mountains, and so there's a lot of species there that are isolated. They've been isolated for years. You get up into tablelands here, and the Galilee Basin doesn't significantly outcrop anywhere else until you get further down here. And of course, Adani coal mine proposal's just in there. So the Galilee Basin goes under here, and you've just got this isolated place with a lot of endemics and unusual ecosystem. So as far as endemic regional ecosystems go, as I said, the lakes, very unusual in this part of the world. The Galilee Basin sediments exposed up in here. The Dungmabula Springs are down here. This is just up in the headwaters of them. White Mountains again. And then down the south here, there's a little bit of shale outcropping with some unusual ecosystems on them too. So they're endemic to that subregion. These are endemic to this subregion, and just a couple of small areas here. That's another little outlier of the Galilee Basin that's exposed. Now, this is the vegetation unit level. So again, here's another measure of rarity at an even finer scale. So they all pop out here. In the previous map, they've been summed up and lost in broader regional ecosystems. When you get down to the veg unit level, you start to see all these unusual things that pop up that have been lost in the grouping. So these are all naturally restricted ones, and they only occur in this subregion. One of the other reasons that the botanists were grouping these things is that a type of country's got to be above I can't remember exactly now, I think it's 100 hectares. It's got to be at least 100 hectares in natural extent, and it's got to occur in 2 or 3 occurrences. I think it was something like that, so that you couldn't map something for 10 hectares and call it a new ecosystem. So that was another reason. A lot of unusual things were lost in the groupings. Now, the other thing is that even though it's in a semi-arid area, it does have well-developed alluvial systems. It does have these lakes, and it does have these springs. So they were pulled out as significant issues. So there's the red areas are saline discharge areas. The blue lakes are closed depressions, and all the other ones are riverine ecosystems. The orange line shows the underlying sandstones of the Great Artesian Basin. So this side's the Galilee Basin underneath it. This is the Great Artesian Basin. So these are intake aquifers for the Great Artesian Basin. So you can see that it's quite likely that these deep sandy soils here, both the red soils of the old surface and the paler soils that have been washed off them into these valleys, they're all part of the recharge of the Great Artesian Basin in this part of the world. Now, as I said, as I said, these deep sandy soils here have got a lot of endemic species. So this map is threatened plants that are listed under the Nature Conservation Act, and they're coloured according to the number present. So this is using vegetation units, not regional ecosystems. So red, in those polygons, there's up to 6 different threatened listed species occurring. So you can see primarily concentrated up here in the White Mountains, to a lesser extent down here. Not so much around the lakes. There's 2 in this. There's the I think it was a forb and the little shrub I mentioned. The odd threatened species through here, but you can see the importance of the old red sandshoot, 3 threatened plants there, and up to 6 up there. And the same thing applies to other plants of conservation significance. So these are things like, and it applies to animals too, and I'll show those maps in a minute. So these are, they might be endemic, they're common enough, but they're endemic. They might be new species. There were half a dozen new species came out of this work. They might be poorly known. Their classification is still unclear. They might be absolutely disjunct from their normal range. So there are some species here that might be 500 or 600 kilometres from the next occurrence. And some of the species, like the animal species, some of the birds, as you'll be aware, are declining terribly in southeastern Australia. Even things like babblers are becoming threatened down south, but up here they're still common. So those declining species were also identified as species of significance. So these are the plants in the old sand sheet, 7 plants falling into those categories, and 5 or 6 up in here, and so on. And this is threatened animals listed under the Nature Conservation Act. Again, you can see the importance of these deep red sand sheets. Now, one of the reasons the animals have done so well here is that it's a fairly soft surface, so things can burrow in and shelter. It has a thing called a poison bush, gastrolobium, on it that's toxic to cattle. So it hadn't been grazed very much. There's no surface waters, so even things like dingoes are constrained, and certainly grazing is constrained. So for a whole lot of reasons, not to mention their evolutionary isolation, you've got, you know, half a dozen listed threatened species on these sand sheets. Not so much up here. It was mainly the plants on those particular soils. But you can see that overall it's a haven for threatened species. And this is the animal species of conservation significance, so endemic, declining, range extensions, all that poorly known, all that sort of thing. And again, 17 to 20 in these deep sand sheets. Okay, so the other strand that we followed in this planning tool was, the land management units. Now, the major threat to the landscapes at the time in this part of the world was overgrazing. I mean, since then, clearings kicked up, and this is a 2002 map. If you look at the current satellite imagery, there's been, for instance, a lot of more clearing gone up in here and here, and around the margins here too. But this is a pre-clear map, so there's no white areas. There's nothing being cleared. It's assumed to be not so much remnant, but assumed to still have the inherent constraints on land use. So it's coloured up, if you like, in the stop-go colouring. The first category, these red soils, I mentioned in this corner those ferrocretes, the shallow, stony ironstone soils. So the two land management units grouped into that colour are shallow stony soils or hard pans, and sandy soils or dunes adjacent to lakes, because the salty content of those and their soft they're not coherent, you know, they've got no structure. So they're very susceptible to degradation. The pink is the deep red earths, because they do compact with overuse. The texture contrast soils that badly compact and often get tunnel erosion, and so on. And you can work your way through right down to the bottom, where these are the clay soils that are gently sloping. They support dense pastures. They're self-mulching, so they tend to hold their moisture better, and they can withstand the hoofs and everything, because they're constantly self-mulching and reforming their protective cover. So there you can see most of the bioregion is quite degradable or moderately, and very few parts are actually capable of handling much grazing at all. So in the detailed report supporting this work, all of these land management units, the 15 that we came up with, all have detailed descriptions of characteristics, the special features and the implications of those things for land management. They're all outlined and highlighted, and sustainable management practices for them are all clearly identified. So the intent being regional scale management, you know, look after the landscape and the species will be looked after. So that was the philosophy we're trying to push through this process. So combining the biodiversity data with the land constraints, and you end up with a map like this, which is future directions. So what we've done is, on the left-hand side, these colours are prioritised. So right at the top of the list, sitting on top of all the other colours, so the other colours are underneath the red, but the red is presented as the important thing in the map, are the REs that are already protected. So they're a given under the Act. Wetlands and riparian areas are also protected under the Vegetation Management Act, so they're a given. And then we start to get into the land capability things. So all the recharge areas for the Great Artesian Basin, the steeper catchments, the lower capability catchments, they all fall into these pink areas. So these deep red soils that have very little fertility and subject to packing. The ferrocrete soils, the skeletal soils, they're all grouped together, all these sandstone ranges. And then we get down into the next layer of biodiversity value. So the plant and animal species of conservation significance. Orange is the biodiversity status, the areas that are degraded and really need to be looked after, because they've got, what's left have got high values. And then we get down to, there's, you know, not much left that actually has some grazing potential, you know, just the yellow areas. Really, the rest of it is extremely vulnerable. And then we get down purple again with the viable soils. So it's a pretty dire picture of the region. And given the clearing rates, there is not much sustainability being approached in this bioregion, which is again the region we started with the reason we started with this bioregion. Now, I'm sorry to say that this was my attempt to try and get the department interested in using the regional ecosystems for integrated regional planning. And I certainly hoped that it would be carried on by the department as a policy. And we went through a huge amount of public consultation with this. We had meetings in half a dozen different centres and worked it all through with the landholders. And overall, the basis was well received. The implications perhaps not quite so, but I've found in my experience in the north that people that lived in these areas like this and further north were used to working with the seasons and the landscape, and they loved it for what it was. And it was a real contrast to the people to the east in the Brigalow Belt who were all about clearing and developing, and they viewed the landscape as something to manipulate. So these people overall were far more conservative, and even having our fauna surveyor knock on the door and say, do you mind if I, start doing a bit of survey work here? They were keen to learn about the land. They didn't say, head off, we don't want threatened species dots all over our place. They were actually open to finding out that more information. So all of that was quite heartening, and I think it really is a good basis for going forward in the bioregion. But as I said, in the long run, the department took a narrower view of biodiversity, and we went down the path of doing those computer-driven, with expert advice, biodiversity planning assessments, which really only looked at the value of areas for biodiversity and not the context of surrounding land uses. But nonetheless, we're here with a framework that's got all sorts of uses, and I think as a framework for assessing impacts and planning future directions and monitoring change, it's a really good framework. So I'll leave it there and leave the extra time, the remaining time, for questions.
Thank you so much, Gethin. That was really fascinating. Felt like we went in with a microscope, but across a landscape. When you say the framework, I'm assuming that there's like a material written up or a book or a publication that mapped out, that shows the steps you guys took for this framework, or how do you put your head, like arms around that framework? Yeah. Yeah,
look, there's a very detailed report, and if I must say so myself, it is a very interesting read because it does collate a whole lot of information about biodiversity conservation and land use down to a really useful level of detail, all in the one document. There's all the descriptions of the vegetation units, there's all the species listed and why they are, the species of significance other than the listed ones as well as the listed ones. There's all the issues of why a particular land management unit has these constraints, so as a handbook for a bioregion, it's to be highly recommended.
Can you please tell us the full reference for it, Gethin? Jody and I seem to be both waiting on the edge of our seats for you to tell us how we can find it.
I think I'm sorry, as I say, it's 2002. I think and again, I can send you the full details, but I think the full name is it's called a biodiversity plan for the desert uplands.
Biodiversity plan for the desert, not the desert, uplands. Okay.
You used to be able to download it from the website. But because it's a bit of an anomaly for the department, I'm not sure that it withstood, it's still there. I couldn't find it last time I quickly looked, but I did find it. You could download a PDF of it on the web. I'm not sure about the maps and that. I haven't had a chance to chase that up yet. We did distribute it as a CD, and for a while you could download a CD version with links and all that sort of thing.
So Jody, I think, has actually asked, are these available for other parts of Australia? But it sounds like this might have been a fairly detailed analysis for one place.
No, that's right. I'm not aware of any others. I mentioned the other day the bioregional plan for the New England tablelands. So this, if you like, is a reverse of the New England tablelands. This is a largely intact bioregion, whereas the New England tablelands was a devastated bioregion, with eucalypt dieback and overclearing and terrible fragmentation of the vegetation. So it divided the region into two simple land zones, if you like, multiple use, looking at catchment protection and conservation and conservative grazing and low capability and all that sort of thing. And then the intensive use zone, which were the dieback zones, which could be continued to be used if more sustainable practices were adopted. And multiple use zones provided the corridors, and where those corridors were being broken, they were the targets for replanting and revegetation and so on and so forth. So that's the only other integrated land use plan I'm aware of.
What year would that have been, Gethin, the bioregional plan for the New England?
1990 or 89 I did it, and it was published by Greening Australia in 1992, I think. I've got some copies of that one remaining. I could send you one or two. I don't have.
If you have a spare, yeah, I'd love to. We'll put it in our little library and make sure that it's available for anyone who wants to have a read.
Yeah.
And won't be giving it to anyone.
Yeah.
All right, well, I've just jotted that in there. Bioregional plan for the New England tablelands, Greening Australia, 1992. So would you say, from your work at least, Gethin, that those two, the one for the desert uplands and the one for the New England tablelands, although they're obviously very different places, but they're both, for people like me, kind of best practice for going through the steps of analysing a bioregion and what's going on?
I believe so, because it does talk about the classification, how and why, and then it takes it right. It takes it right through to well, in the case of the New England tablelands, for example, what the implications of the constraints are and what the best land use would be for those different subregions. So it still takes the subregional approach. In this case, with the increasing power of GIS and so on, the desert uplands was basically a hand-drawn map initially. Sorry, the New England was a hand-drawn map in those days.
Wow.
But with increasing power, we can now do that same thing at a regional ecosystem level. As I say, both reports are packed with information. Presented in a really user-friendly way. They were written for the layperson. So yeah, I would highly recommend them.
Excellent. We'll be making sure we have them. Gethin, Andre has asked a question. How long did it take to produce? I think he's referring to either of those reports. He says, I'm guessing for all of a state or Australia, this would be quite a substantial project.
Yes, well, as I mentioned on Wednesday, the Rakes project to do that rapid analysis of Queensland in '77, we got $30,000 of funding from the feds to do that one. At the same time, CSIRO were given $2 million to do a similar study in South Australia using satellite imagery and so on, and all their expertise and multidisciplinary team and so on. So it can be done on the cheap, but if you want it done to a degree that's going to be acceptable to modern standards, yeah, sure, quite expensive. You could do this in Queensland now. The fauna data and the detailed species, plant species data is still patchy, I'm sorry to say. Cape York, I mean, we've had some really great botanists. John Nelder in Cape York's got a lot of threatened species information. John Thompson was the herbarium mapper for the desert uplands, and he had a really keen eye for species, and he spent a lot of time, which is why we've got such good species data here. But the level of information available across the state at the species level is quite patchy. The RE mapping, I think it's now complete for the state, but I'm not sure how well it's been reviewed since I left the department in 2011. I'm not sure. Those review processes seem to have broken down in terms of quite widely assessed. So I'm not sure how they've ended up.
Actually, Gethin, before we go to the next question, I think you may have mentioned in your talk on Wednesday what happened in 2012 and 2013. Could you just briefly tell folks where a lot of these mapping projects are up to and why they've kind of come to a standstill?
Yes, so this approach was essentially, as I say, taken over by the GIS approach. I mean, all departments want to operate on the cheap these days, and there's a wide assumption that we know everything we need to know about the place. Why aren't we doing something? Well, we don't, in fact. And it wasn't until this, I mean, we didn't have a vegetation map for the state until this program started. And now we've ended up with an integrated system, which started in, the mapping started in about 99, no, maybe early 98, somewhere around there. And it's taken up until a year or two ago to complete for the whole state. So, 20 years of pretty intensive mapping. So most states aren't there yet. Western Australia's got 1 to 1 million. We've got 1 to 100,000, and along the coast 1 to 50,000. And again, it's the strength of the method is the reliability with which you can interpret and extrapolate information. That's why we're so far ahead of the other states. Victoria has got very detailed mapping. Tasmania is doing pretty good. South Australia's got a really good framework from that SIRO work, but I'm not sure how much detail they've gone down to since then. So anyway, that momentum was broken. So we got the BPAs, the essential habitat mapping, and the coastal management planning. All that work was based on the RE mapping and came about as a result of it. All that came to a stop with the Newman government in Queensland. And really, I mean, we've got the Veg Management Act has been resurrected. But at that stage, 2011, we had a state draft biodiversity strategy, which built on all this work and was very forward thinking. We had a connectivity conservation framework to underpin the state strategy. And that's the map right at the start here that I'll just go back up to it. That's the map from that handbook. And we've got corridors going down to a much finer scale that would very easily provide a framework for replanting and carbon capture and so on. But none of that's been re-erected. So that's all come to a screaming stop in Queensland. And the Abbott government in 2013 pulled out of the NRS acquisition program. They stopped offering money to the states. At one stage, they would offer the states $3 out of every 4 to acquire land for conservation. And that's when things were really kicking along. That's when the big park expansion in Queensland occurred. We really made good use of that because we could justify all our acquisitions very clearly for the feds. So Queensland did very well out of that. That's all stopped, which means that the bioregional framework, cooperative national one, to underpin that program, the impetus for that has also gone. So the last revision of the subregions nationally that I can find is the 2012 version.
That's IBRIS 7?
IBRIS 7, yeah. Yep.
Okay. That's very good context, I think, for people. Until your talk on Wednesday, I didn't realise how much had stopped. We know many environmental and social justice issues were changed, let's put it politely, after 2012 in Queensland and 2013 at the federal level, but I didn't realise that it, down to the level of mapping and looking after a lot of the information systems has also changed. Then there's a couple of questions. I'm aware that we've only really got 5 minutes left, but what I might do is take one more question, officially close for anyone who would like to jump off. But if you're happy to stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes to answer a few questions, we might keep chatting.
Yes, sure.
Even have a quick peek at some of those maps. But a really good question here. Oops. Sorry, it's Linda. Linda has asked, would part of analysing and understanding a bioregion also require acknowledging how traditional knowledge and cultural values are embedded in the landscape and land? For example, understanding where food and other resources are located and recognising that some grasslands are the result of millennia of fire stick management. Before Gethin replies from his experience, I guess I can say from the AILA point of view, in terms of looking to the future of using other bioregional frameworks and understandings, absolutely the answer is yes, totally embedded in with, but the differences of approach between Western science, First Nations peoples, and then the ways that they're coming together more and more. But Gethin, what do you, what's your response to that question?
Yeah, look, it's a huge layer of knowledge that would be fantastic to build into the Western knowledge we're slowly accumulating. I mean, you know, we really know so little about the ecology of the state. You know, I mean, we're still at the level of working out where things are, let alone, you know, what they do to each other and what things do to them. And, you know, I've previously worked with archaeologists in Cape York primarily, looking at food plants, working with local people to go around and learn about the plants and going through all the ethnographic records in other areas where we couldn't access people that knew their uses. You know, so we've tried to do that in the past at a species level, but at a landscape level, no. I mean, we can see what the removal of fire from the landscape has done, the whole woody thickening argument about that's driven some of the tree clearing, whereby a lot of graziers see standing grass as a resource that you don't burn, not as something that you can reinvigorate and or at the same time control woody regrowth that would otherwise shade the grasses out, you know. So we've got country thickening up and people wanting to clear it because there's no longer any light or moisture for the grasses to grow underneath. So yeah, fire's a whole other thing. But the seasonality of things and what's missing and understanding really what climate change is doing to the natural patterns. Yeah, look, it would be wonderful to bring that information to bear. We just need to work cooperatively. We need to engage them. And this has not been done in that way. This work hasn't been done in that way.
Thank you, Gethin. Very thorough answer. Cameron has asked a question. Studying governance has taught me that the best intentions are often perversely spun for political and economic means. Through your experience, have you noticed any patterns as to how traffic light colouring for conservation values has been flipped for policy creation?
Yes, I have. I think the capture of the, well, I see it as the capture of the RE mapping by the Vegetation Management Act and its use for clearing. So the idea of low capability lands was sort of dropped. It became an issue of how much is left, and capability was less important. That was perceived to be, well, they may not be very capable, these lands, but, you know, when we clear them, we'll manage them well. You know,
Yes.
it was that sort of a thing. One of the worst examples I saw was for a long time, we tried to use remote sensing to assess condition. And there was one program we did cooperatively with DPI south of Townsville in the Bowen Basin grazing lands there. And they had an A, B, C, D condition assessment, A being the best. And A was considered to be underutilised because it was in such condition. It wasn't viewed as something to value. It quickly was targeted as being land that could carry more cattle. And so all that really good stuff that really should have been kept as, you know, the store or the reference or the biodiversity, you know, bank was seen as unused. And, yeah. So yes, I agree. And a lot of it's to do with education and a lot of it's to do with intent.
Thank you, Gethin. Look, I might officially wrap up just so anyone who really has to go back to their work or life feels that they can do so. What I'd like to do is say a huge thank you to you, Gethin, for such generous sharing of your knowledge and the history of the development of these ideas and these approaches, which honestly people like me would never have found without bumping into you at Magnetic Island. So for everyone who's on the call and can be seen, please feel free to do a little air clap like me or press your clap button. But I'd like to really say thank you, Gethin, for your generous time this morning. Some of the details have blown my hair back. Some of the bits and pieces I haven't understood yet, but the framework you've shared is really powerful and very exciting. I've got a number of people coming through saying, thank you so much, Gethin, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you, Gethin and well. Thank you, Ayla and Gethin from Jane in Victoria. Lots of thank yous from different folks. So I will keep recording, but if you have to dash off, we have officially thanked Gethin. You don't have to feel like you're slipping away in a anti-social fashion. Gethin, there is one great question that has popped back up about the classification systems. I wonder if you and I could to and fro until people like myself, and I can't remember the name of the lady, a nice handle on this. Would you mind jumping forward? You had a really great slide that showed, I think, bioregion, subregion, regional ecosystem. Could you take us back to that, that slide? I can tell you when to stop if you don't. That's one. So that's a starting point. Can I just clarify, and then I might take over screen and show you my effort to do this. So thank you, Jude and others. Yes, thank you for being with us for 3 days. So looking at landscapes, that's good. It's got the bioregions, it shows a bioregion close up. It doesn't show a subregion, but that's okay. Is it fair to say that in terms of scale, is the next smallest unit under the subregion a regional ecosystem, or is it a land use unit?
No, see, the thing about the regional ecosystem is it's an artificial construct. It's very useful, but it's not really part of a hierarchy. It's come to be viewed as part of a hierarchy. You go from the bioregion to the regional ecosystem. That's the way it's used these days. But the strict classification is the bioregion, subregion, land system, which is a pattern, and then you break the pattern up into land units, and that's your finest unit.
So the bioregion, subregion, land system, and then land
unit.
Land unit.
That's right. And the regional ecosystem sits somewhere between the land system and the land unit. So it was to bridge the gap. The land units are too small to map. The land systems are too complex. So the
land zones can appear sort of anywhere, can't they?
Yes, that's right. Land zones, an ecosystem will always be a land zone. So if you call up a regional ecosystem, you're also calling up the land zone of that ecosystem, because it's the second number. It's the way it's been identified. So you can generate a land zone map very easily for anywhere. So within a bioregion or a subregion, you just call up the regional ecosystem mapping and you colour it by land zone, and there's your land zone map.
So hold that thought for 1 second, Gethin. I just want to show you so what I've typed is that in terms of not comparable scales, but the hierarchical scales,
yep.
We've got ecoregion, bioregion, subregion. This murky space of regional ecosystem sort of fits there, but not purely, and then land unit. And then at any scale, you can look at vegetation cover or biodiversity or geology or whatever, can't you? Is that sort of basic?
You've missed the land system under subregion.
Okay. That's definitely hierarchical. Like,
yep. That's now the true hierarchy. We say geology, but and that's because we've got the geology maps. But we're really talking in land zones and regional ecosystems and land systems and all those finer units. We're talking about geomorphology.
Okay.
So we've got a geology, and the way that erodes and gets weathered and its origin, all of that reflects it will result in the sort of soils present. So its age will determine how well formed the soils are or how leached they are. You know, and the interesting thing is it's the quaternary that is least well mapped. When you get to southeast Queensland and the near coastal areas, they pull out the the Holocene alluvials, the last 10,000 years. So they're effectively your active alluvials. They're pulled out. But for most of Queensland, they're mapped as quaternary alluvials. So you need to go deeper into either land systems or air photos or soil maps to pull out the different aged quaternary alluvials, because they range from those very shallow, hard-setting soils over a hard pan, right through to deep, fertile alluvial soils, all mapped as QA. Sand sheets will be mapped as QA, you know, deep sandy soils on tops of sandstones are often mapped as QA. So that whole unconsolidated part of the Australian landscape, by and large, is poorly mapped, yet it's the one we use most, and it's the one that is most vulnerable to degradation. That's where the strength of the REs is, and that's where the problem between Land Zone 3 and 5 is so critical to drive accurate mapping.
Okay. Well, I hope that the person who asked that question, and I got lost in the middle bits too, I hope that that helps clarify. I'm going to stick like glue to this little simple overview, and I might just to recap, hang on, I'm just moving my own Zoom screen around to share this. So, whoops, oh, why does it keep jumping? Oh dear, sorry folks.
Oh, look, before you leave that slide,
Yeah.
it may be helpful, just because it is an awfully complicated thing. I mean, it slips off my tongue because I'm so used to it, but I know how complicated it is for most people. Far too many terms, it's a very complicated thing. Underneath the sub-region, you could put land zone in brackets.
Okay. So it's bigger than a land system.
Yeah, oh, sorry, not under sub-region, under bioregion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did miss that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've just got a question in the chat. Land system geomorphology. Aviva's saying land system geomorphology.
Yeah, a land system is generally a geomorphic complex, and it's generally dominated by a particular geomorphology. So hence those, if I go, those Mitchell-Normanby land system maps I keep flashing up, they show very clearly, it's all quaternary alluvial, those big fans, but they're all different ages. So they've all got different soils and vegetation. Even though the origin is very similar, their age is very different. The degree of weathering and soil development is very different. The leachings are different, so the vegetation is different. The flooding regimes are different. The nutrients are different, but they're all mapped as QA.
I think for a non-scientist, that's probably enough. For the scientists in the group, forgive me if I've taken up time that you would prefer to ask another question. And
Michelle, I think one of the really exciting things that's come out of this talk in terms of how you're going to be talking in the future is when Gethin mentioned the bioregion isn't just like the living organisms, it's like the geo-bio. So maybe you can start to kind of, just to kind of help people, it's imaginary that what's happening underneath and what's happened in the past has created the living environment. I think that just because you put geology there, so it's just sort of like just finding that language to.
Yeah, that's why we originally used biophysical.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, thank you, Aviva. I only had the geology because I was actually capturing the geomorphology reference to the blue bits.
Yeah, look, the geology, if we didn't have the continental geology data set, we would be nowhere. It's absolutely fundamental. But the problem with, as I said, is that they're only interested in the hard rock where the minerals are.
Yes.
It's only really in the last 10 or 20 years that the geomorphic history of Australia has become far more interesting to people, and the new geologists are really chasing it.
Fantastic. I have noticed that too as a non-scientist, that whenever we started looking at our mapping tool, all of the info was out there really with a view to how can we find the resources and extract them, as opposed to where is the wonder and the beauty and the gorgeousness of the things we want to learn about in our place. So I'm glad to hear you say, Gethin, that a generation of geologists and others are looking across.
Well, look, just as an aside, I don't know if you'll have come across them, but the Bureau of Mineral Resources in Canberra put out a whole series of geology, regional geologies. So there'll be a lovely map of various scales, but a really detailed accompanying report. And that covers all the geomorphic evolution of the landscape. So it gets right down into the age and the sequence and the origin of these things.
Excellent. Very good. So I'm going to stop sharing screen, and unless there are any other questions, we might release Gethin back into the wilds of North Queensland.
Back to island paradise, Michelle.
Absolutely. Oh, look, I hadn't been to Maggie Island. I was there when we met 2 years ago, but I hadn't been there since I was a kid, something like 8 years old, which is a while back. And it is so beautiful. So thank you for, and look, I'd like to acknowledge that Gethin had to get a ferry across to Townsville and stay at his daughter's place to have reliable internet to share with us. So we've caused family reunion, but also an inconvenience. So I am deeply grateful for your time. So we're going to wrap it up right now. For anyone who's interested in this space and the work that we're starting to explore, whether you want to learn with us and play with us and join us on the journey of a very multidisciplinary approach, and not just the sciences and not just the Western knowledge, but into Indigenous knowledge and human love of place, anyone who'd like to join with us on that journey, please connect. We will be continuing to invite Gethin until he's sick of us to come and talk at different events and to help us map out some of the work we're doing. But we'll also be inviting a lot of folks from different areas of ecological limits, including our Planetary Boundaries series will continue with some of these legal ideas that Will Stephan has talked about in his masterclass. We're having Paulo Magalhães from Portugal talking about the common heritage and pushing for international legal recognition of the Earth system, which I can't tell you, it's an absolute revolution in the legal brain of the world. How best can we hear about all events? Please stay connected to via our mailing list and our Facebook page. If you do pop in and out of Facebook, always keep an eye on the events listings in Ayla's Facebook page. By registering for this event, you're automatically on our mailing list now, and you're welcome to jump off it, but they're all connected. And also the page you used to register for this wonderful workshop is the main link for the whole page of different events. We'll be having a special webinar. I'm really excited. We've got a donut economics expert who works directly with Kate Raworth in the Donut Economics Lab. We're just locking him in for an evening in October. And he's introduced me to some of the folks in Amsterdam who are doing the world's first donut economic framework for a city. So all of this stuff fits together. Ayla is extremely multidisciplinary, and that's why we've been auspicing the New Economy Network, why we have worked with our Indigenous elders to create Future Dreaming as a sister organisation. All of this wonderful work fits under the umbrella of Greenprints as both a stepwise approach to understanding place and rethinking what we're doing, but also as a knowledge centre, I guess, for great people like yourselves to stay in touch and share what you're up to. I'm going to read Mandy's lovely thank you. That wraps it up. Thank you so much, Gethin. So informative. And Ayla and Michelle, so grateful for the last 3 days of sessions. Looking forward to more and more. We have to keep this dialogue and learning moving forward. I couldn't conclude with anything better than that. So thank you again, Gethin. Big hugs. Thank you so much.